And we are live in. Okay, we are live, ma'am.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all the participants and viewers of the international webinar on multicultural Doris Lessing. The Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media at West Bengal State University, which will be referred to as CSGCM henceforth, is organizing this two-day event in collaboration with the Doris Lessing Society or DLS to commemorate the Women's Month and initiate the DLS South Asia chapter at CSGCM. The reason why we were so very enthusiastic to uh, offer a home to the DLS South Asia chapter is primarily for two reasons. Since gender studies is a major thrust area of the center, a study of women's writing or écriture feminine and an exploration of our experiential world forms an inevitable part of our research and deliberations. Doris Lessing, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2007 for her feminist masterpiece, The Golden Notebook, fits perfectly within this broad domain of interest. Secondly, the Department of English has been teaching Doris Lessing's works for quite some time. We hope that students will be more inspired to read her works and assume a comparative approach to her writing. This is also a means by which a writer can be given an afterlife beyond her temporal and geographical boundaries. So, with this brief welcome address, let us move on to the keynote speaker. This keynote address will be delivered by Professor Josna Rege, who will set the right tone for the webinar and also tell us about her vision of the DLS South Asia chapter. Uh, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rege. Professor Rege is a professor of English at Worcester State University in Worcester, Massachusetts, where she teaches world and post-colonial literatures, the modern and contemporary novel, and contemporary women's writing. Her scholarship is on nationalism and the Indian novel in English, and on South Asian women's writing across national and linguistic boundaries. She has published a book on the Indian English novel and articles and book chapters on Doris Lessing, Anita Desai, Rukhsana Ahmed, C.S. Lakshmi, Shashi Deshpande, and others. Most recently, both her teaching and scholarly interests have been focused on issues of immigrants and refugees, citizenship, and democracy. Professor Rege has been a fan of Doris Lessing's work since she was 19 years old and has served as president of the Doris Lessing Society since 2019. So over to Professor Josna Rege.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakravarti. It's really great to be here. Good evening to those of you in India, Bangladesh, and points east. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you in West Asia, Europe, and the United States. I'm delighted and honored to be able to participate in this two-day webinar, Multicultural Doris Lessing through the South Asian lens, in order to launch DLS South Asia at an auspicious time of year, Women's Month, and on the eve of Bangladesh's Independence Day. Thanks to Professor Chandrava Chakravarti for having invited me to speak on behalf of the Doris Lessing Society, co-sponsor of this webinar. Congratulations to Professor Swati Mitra, who's done a tremendous amount of work in order to organize the Society's first chapter. And this on top of her regular teaching load, household responsibilities, and bouts of COVID-19 in her family. I'm going to talk about Doris Lessing and her work for a while. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history of the Doris Lessing Society and a vision looking forward for the new chapter. Doris Lessing's immersion in Sufism and Sufi teaching stories quickened her interest in world tales, traveling stories that pop up in many far-flung cultures and arise in different forms over thousands of years. In the next half hour, I'll briefly touch upon these traveling stories and indicate how they shaped her creative method and vision. As Lessing's work itself does, the Doris Lessing Society seeks to carry forth that expansive creative vision. And I believe that DLS South Asia is well placed to do so at this moment in time. Doris Lessing had no patience for those who sought to pigeonhole her, for bureaucrats, for academics in particular, academics like us, who regularly commit what was for her the cardinal sin of compartmentalization, of hoarding knowledge and experience in separate disciplinary silos whose walls must continually be shored up. As she wrote in an introduction to an edition of the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, quote, "There is a deep and terrible need in us all to systematize and make order." But because she was largely unschooled, almost wholly self-taught, there were no artificial barriers to her exploration. She would immerse herself in large bodies of knowledge all at once and follow flowing currents where they led her. But she never settled in for long, never allowed herself to get too comfortable. She warns, also in her introduction to Ecclesiastes, "Thus do the living springs of knowledge, of wisdom, become captured by institutions and by churches of various kinds." So it was that she outgrew label after label, seeking and shedding ever-widening frames of reference, rippling ever outward. Her lack of formal education allowed her to grow by leaps and bounds and to keep growing. It not only informed her reading, it shaped her mind as a writer and a storyteller. As a storyteller, Doris Lessing's long immersion in Sufism and Sufi teaching stories deepened her interest in world tales, as Idris Shah called them. In Shah's 1979 collection called World Tales, Lessing's Sufi teacher retold 65 folk tales from around the world that have traveled far and wide, the same ancient core story, quote, recited by people all over the world who know nothing of its origins. Calling them a basic fund of human fictions, he notes that this form of culture remains, this is Idris Shah speaking, this form of culture remains when nations, languages, and faiths have long since died. Not only does it constantly appear in different incarnations, but from time to time, remarkable collections are assembled and enjoy a phenomenal vogue, after which they lapse and are reborn, perhaps in another culture, perhaps centuries later, to delight, attract, thrill, captivate yet another audience, end quotes. Lessing had a particular interest in the accommodating narrative forms that collected and carried these collections. The frame stories that enabled their travel, circulation, and assimilation into new cultures and changing circumstances. Speaking of one particularly well-traveled form, the frame story, she has written, quote, "What this method of storytelling or this design is supposed to illustrate is the way that in life one thing leads to another, often unexpectedly, and that one may not make neat and tidy containers for ideas and events or hopes and possibilities, and that it is not easy to decide where anything begins or ends." Her description of the function of the frame story's design sounds remarkably like the method she herself used when she set out to learn anything new. Such was the method that led her to write the remarkable Canopus in Argos archives in a burst of energy in her 60s that enabled her to produce 5 novels in as many years, beginning with the work I consider to be her tour de force, Ray Colonized Planet 5, Shikasta. Whenever as a child I spoke of one of Aesop's fables, coming back from school and telling my parents the tale of the fox and the crow, for instance, my dear father would always say, "Cha, that story comes from the Panchatantra. They all do." My father was both right and wrong. The Panchatantra, written in Sanskrit, is one of those remarkable collections that Idris Shah speaks of in World Tales, dating back to at least 300 BC, but many of whose component stories, most of them animal fables, are much older. It is a Niti Shastra, a work that serves the purpose of teaching its readers Niti, the wise conduct of life. The story goes that the sage known as Vishnu Sharma, probably a fictitious name, used the fables to teach the art of statecraft to a king's 3 layabout sons, lazy dullards all. Just about every major Indian language has a version of Panchatantra. By 2009, there were more than 200 versions of the text in more than 50 languages around the world. But Panchatantra is only one name for this collection. In Bengal, for example, an independent version circulates as the Hitopadesha. The Panchatantra shares stories with the fables of Aesop, as well as the Jataka tales, stories of the previous births of the Buddha in different forms. It shares identical verses with Kautilya's Arthashastra, also a work on statecraft for a ruler, probably Chandragupta Maurya in the 3rd century BCE. Traveling to Europe, it tended to be referred to as the fables of Bidpai, Vidyapati in Sanskrit, both fictitious names, it is thought. It was translated into Pallavi and then into Arabic in 570 CE as Kalila and Dimna. From Arabic, it was translated into Syriac, Greek, Spanish, Kashfi's 15th century Persian Anwari Suhaili, which is translated as The Lights of Canopus, and thence into Turkish. It was translated into German in 1483 and printed on the same press as the Gutenberg Bible, and into French. In 12th century CE, Rabbi Joel translated it into Hebrew, whence it was translated into Latin, from Latin to Spanish, from Spanish to Italian, from Italian to English. The earliest English versions of the Fables of Bidpai was produced in 1570 CE by Sir Thomas North as the Moral Philosophy of Doni, after the name of the Italian translator. Some scholars have argued that it was drawn upon by Shakespeare. Those of you who have been rightly waiting impatiently for me to mention Doris Lessing in this Wikipedian litany will have pricked up your ears at the mention of Canopus. And indeed, Lessing does discuss her fascination with the appearance of both Canopus and Argos in Kashfi's Persian translation of Kalila and Dimna in Anwar-e Suhaili. She traces some of the different guises in which the stories traveled in her introduction to a 1980 version of Kalila and Dimna, Selected Fables of Bidpai, retold by Ramsay Wood in 1980, the year after the publication of Shikasta. In her discussion of this much-traveled and eminently flexible frame story, her observations shed light on her characteristic preoccupations, her use of sources, and her creative method itself. Speaking of the Sanskrit Arthashastra, Lessing wrote that the author, quote, Kautilya, was a very cool one indeed. Surely this book must have influenced Machiavelli when he wrote The Prince. If not, then the books come from the same region of human experience. Here, Lessing shows us her fascination not only with how stories are carried from place to place through translation, but how they can take different forms appropriate to the times and places in which they arise, and also how they can arise independently in ways that are not fully understood, but that make sense. You may recall that Lessing has frequently noted that the source of an idea does not necessarily belong to one originating genius, but that it is, quote, in the air at a given time, and that many different people may tap into and draw from it. In the same introduction to Ramsay Wood's Kalila and Dimna, Lessing reaches back 1,500 years to learn something of value about the transmission of knowledge. Speaking of the earliest translations of the Fables of Bidpai into Arabic, one by, quote, a Zoroastrian who converted to Islam, another by an honored Jewish scholar, she remarks, quote, in those comparatively flexible days, scholars were able more easily than now to appreciate each other and work together across boundaries. She goes on to say how difficult it is in this modern age, when our worldview is most often constrained by nations and nationalisms, to imagine a world in which the chief differences were religious rather than national or racial. Lessing does not valorize a religious worldview over a nation-based one, but she does suggest that much is lost in modern times when the flows of knowledge are cut off at national borders. In the US, for example, for all its citizens' purchasing power and for all the new books published every year, the percentage of new titles that are translations from a language other than English is minuscule, no more than 3%. Between 2016 and 2018, the number of new English translations published in the US never rose out of the 600s and shrank by more than 8%. In her discussion of the amazing popularity of the Fables of Bidpai, Lessing asks what their secret is. Quote, what enabled it to be absorbed without resistance and to be loved by Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Christians, Muslims, and Jews? One answer she offers is that all these traditions recognize that tales and parables are for instruction and illustration as well as for entertainment. She said that medieval Europe rushed to India to find and translate the book because its fame was known and they wanted its aid in learning how to live better. But nowadays, she adds dryly, we use this phrase, live better, in a different sense. I mention this because Doris Lessing's work has been routinely criticized for being too didactic. But here, as elsewhere, she is utterly unapologetic about this. Instead, she points to the many traditions in which stories are beloved precisely because they teach us something of value, in a form that is both palatable and memorable. Case in point, those doltish princes who were unable to learn anything until Vishnu Sharma delivered the lessons as animal fables. I want to talk a little bit about names. Now to Canopus and its relationship to the fables of Bidpai and to Lessing's Canopus in Argos archives. In her introduction to Kalila and Dimna, she writes of the title of this Persian translation and how it came to be. Quote, Anwari Suhaili, or the Lights of Canopus, is one of the best-known versions of the fables of Bidpai. An emir or general called Suhaili, which meant of Canopus, invited one al-Kashifi to make a new version, end quotes. Lessing goes on to discuss Anwari Suhaili as one of a small number of Persian classics of Sufic origin that came into being around this time in the 15th century. Apparently it was immensely popular and used Bidpai's fables as, quote, a frame or lattice around which to weave associated tales, anecdotes, reminiscences, current scientific information, and verse of different kinds, end quotes. But Lessing asks, who was this general or governor, quote, who was able to bring about the creation of a new Sufi classic using the ancient Bidpai material to do it? And who was al-Kashifi, who was engaged to do the work? And Lessing proceeds in the compressed space of her introduction to Ramsay Wood's retelling to show us two things about her design and her creative method: how she attends to names and their meanings, and how she uses that same quality of attention to follow leads that emerge from her seemingly haphazard reading. She starts with the name in the collection's title, The Lights of Canopus. Quote, I was when names were often chosen to describe qualities or as an indication of qualities a person hoped to acquire. People were expected to regard names as signposts, as it were. Lessing had already been exploring the way that, quote, Canopus the star is much embedded in the mythology of ancient times. And when you trace it to this country or that, it melds and merges into other names, places, personages. And at this time, she came upon Astronomical Curiosities, a book published in 1909, and drawing heavily from, quote, al-Sufi, an Arabian astronomer of the constellation Argo, which in turn is associated with Noah's Ark. Canopus was an ancient name from Egypt, referring to Canopus, the pilot of Menelaus who died of a snake bite. Some say that the star is named after him and worshipped by the ancient Egyptians. And now I'm quoting from Doris Lessing, but Canopus is also the god Osiris and is in the more remarkable and ever-changing relationship with Isis, who was the star Sirius. But the emir known as Suhaili, who commissioned Anwari Suhaili, The Lights of Canopus, was also associated with Canopus. In Healing a Wounded World, Visions of Doris Lessing, written by Thomas Cleary in collaboration with Sirtaz Aziz, Cleary describes Canopus as a transnational civilizing authority. Anwari Suhaili's ideas, I'm quoting here, were further disseminated through its influence on outstanding European authors, including Lully, Shakespeare, Boccaccio, and La Fontaine. Hence, the name Canopus can be associated with an educational undertaking, crossing conventional cultural and religious boundaries, end quotes. Cleary also tells us that Bidpai means keeper of knowledge, and was thought to refer to the sage Kautilya, author of the Arthashastra. In Healing a Wounded World, Cleary offers possible meanings for many of the names in Shikasta, meanings that usually point to the function of the character. To give just one more example, Johor, or in his Shikastan form, George Sherban, when pronounced with the Arabic hard H, means, quote, bringing to light, revealing, or cleaning out. And when pronounced with the Arabic soft H, it means essence or substance. Speaking of the book's author, Al-Kashifi, whose name means that which is manifested or shown or demonstrated, Lessing similarly suggests an interpretation of the name based on what his work does. Even this brief look into the reading that Lessing did in constructing the frame story for Canopus in Argos archives suggests the depth of her indebtedness to the rich fund of stories that we can draw upon anew in different times and places, the signposts that she has embedded in the names themselves to lead a reader through the work. It also suggests her creative method and her creative process itself, both in its methodology and in its design. We see Lessing using these techniques from her earliest works, long before her encounter with Sufism. In her introduction to Kalila and Dimna, so I want to talk just briefly about the concept of learning to unlearn. Expanding one's vision requires removing the blinkers that limit what one can see. Lessing's work teaches us to break the hold of habits that have become destructive. In a 1982 essay she wrote for the Asia Society, she wrote, quote, as Richard Burton, the English Sufi, said 100 years ago in his marvelous poem, The Qasida, what we have to learn first is how to unlearn. Unlearn thirst for sensations, flattery, attention. Unlearn national, racial, class biases, end quotes. In her 1981 introduction to Idris Shah's Learning How to Learn, Psychology and Spirituality in the Sufi Way, she enumerates some of these obstacles to learning, those mental blocks that the poet William Blake called mind-forged manacles. The English language itself she names as an obstacle to learning, to some kinds of learning. She says it is impoverished in that it lacks words and concepts that we need. Another obstacle that she calls a Himalayan block, and one of the few non-South Asian writers who I've heard using the term Himalayan like that. We always say Himalayan blunder, right? This Himalayan block, that as she sees it, is the effect of 2,000 years of institutionalized Christianity. In her essay in the Asia Society Journal, she writes, we all rush after leaders and gurus, political and religious, because we've been taught to admire leaders, want to be given orders, to join groups, to submit ourselves to authority, to say that knowledge is beyond, and that at best we can have it only when we are dead. We have learned negative and defeatist attitudes through 2,000 years of an authoritarian religion, which has left scars on our minds. We have internalized its rigidities. We have not been taught that this is what we are like. On the contrary, we are told we are free, democratic, self-determined, individualistic. And as a result, we are infinitely vulnerable to being conditioned, to tyrants, to propaganda, to gurus and leaders of priests of all kind. That was a long quote, sorry. One of the criticisms of Lessing's later work is its movement away from the personal. Many critics and people who fell in love with Lessing in the Golden Notebook years bemoan the loss of that small personal voice, which he famously claimed for the novelist in the collection of the same name, edited by our own Doris Lessing Society member, Paul Schluter. And a movement away from that voice to a more impersonal, detached view of human interactions. She does not by any means leave individuals behind, but rather she looks at their function and the needs of their time. To quote from Doris Lessing Society member Sogra Azari Pasand, whose essay on the emancipation of women in Canopus in Argos won her an honorable mention in the Society's 2021 Student Essay Awards. Quote, Her main focus is not on an individual suffering, but on the whole. That is, to quote Sadi, the Persian poet of the 13th century, human beings are members of a whole. Lessing, through her female protagonists, does not mean to concentrate merely on individuality or to limit herself to special groups or sexes. Rather, she looks upon the larger picture of humanity. End quotes. Azari Pasand quotes from an essay by Lessing, that same one written for the Asia Society in 1982, saying, where she said, "It is not enough for us to be concerned with the situation of women. It is a situation of humankind which should be our concern." By constantly thrusting out her characters, male and female alike, from settled homes, Lessing doesn't allow us to get too comfortable, to stagnate, to allow, quote, the living springs of knowledge to be captured by institutions, end quote. They are forced to grow again and again. Lessing herself, continually shedding skins in this way, did not renounce her earlier identities, communism, feminism, psychoanalysis. She didn't renounce them so much as begin to see them as only part of a much larger picture. So back to the storyteller. In the end, for Lessing, her refuge is the story itself. We can always return to it, and she always does, continually reminding us that we humans are storytelling animals. In her Nobel Prize speech, provocatively entitled "On Not Winning the Nobel Prize," she said, "The storyteller is deep inside every one of us. The story maker is always with us. Let us suppose our world is ravaged by war, by the horrors that we all of us easily imagine. Let us suppose floods wash through our cities, the seas rise. But the storyteller will be there, for it is our imaginations which shape us, keep us, create us, for good and for ill. It is our stories that will recreate us when we are torn, hurt, even destroyed. It is the storyteller, the dream maker, the myth maker that is our phoenix, that represents us at our best and at our most creative." End quotes. It is this vision and imagination that offers us the greatest hope for humankind amidst the ruins of a broken world. So now I shift gears altogether and want to talk a little bit about the history of the Doris Lessing Society, which goes back to 1971, 51 years ago. A small group of young scholars, mostly women, but not exclusively, who admired Doris Lessing's work, began to organize a conference session on some aspect of it at the Modern Language Association's annual convention. In 1976, they founded the Doris Lessing newsletter, which later developed, 25 years later, into the peer-reviewed journal Doris Lessing Studies. And in 1979, they formed the Doris Lessing Society as an allied organization of the MLA, the Modern Language Association. For years, the society had a membership which was mostly academics from the US and Canada, meeting only at the MLA. It was very few people could afford to travel to join the MLA and to travel to the US for those annual conventions. And there were very few extra funds available for international travel. In spring 2004, the Society organized the first International Doris Lessing Conference in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the US, and in 2007, Point West in Australia, say. Since the start of the pandemic, though, we've continued to organize our annual sessions at MLA, but we've been organizing our annual business meetings online. And this has had the advantage of enabling people from around the world to attend and participate. And we intend to go on in that way and move outwards from MLA to be more inclusive. Today, more and more of our members are not MLA members, even if they are academics. Today, the majority of the Society's membership is still from the United States, but now it is much more international and getting increasingly more so. Our members are based in more than 20 different countries and are by no means reading and writing on Lessing in English alone, but also in a number of different languages, including Chinese, Turkish, and Spanish. In the past year alone, besides the US and the UK and Canada, Our new members have been based in France, Germany, China, India, and Iran, Doris Lessing's own birthplace. Visitors to our website in 2021 came from 101 different countries and from every continent. But our changing profile is not just a matter of numbers. A more globally diverse membership requires that we think about Doris Lessing differently. We will approach her necessarily from different angles, filtering our readings through different cultural codes and worldviews. We will consider new themes and reconsider old ones that will allow us to develop a more multifaceted understanding of her body of work. Issues and texts that might formerly have been dismissed or underappreciated will come into focus anew. And we will continually be jolted out of fixed ways of thinking. I think Doris Lessing would have approved. A multilingual consciousness will also necessitate that we do our work differently. The views of Doris Lessing's work through a South Asian lens will be plural and multifaceted. For of course, there is no one South Asian lens. It is my hope that Doris Lessing Society South Asia, the first chapter of the society, will operate as a model for other chapters worldwide. It's also my hope that it will flourish at the borders of cultures, languages, and genres, free from fixed habits of thought, inclusive, and ever curious. May it continue to be inspired by Lessing's own practices, many of them taking their inspiration from Asia, carrying us into and across cultures through translation, transformation, and the immortal power of storytelling. I'm so looking forward to this webinar and moving forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rege. It's been a very lucid and yet scholarly keynote address, and it has, of course, brilliantly set the tone for the entire webinar. We don't take questions usually after a keynote address, and we are here free to move on to the next business session. But again, if people have responses and questions to Professor Rege, we'll be able to come back and take at least some of them in the roundtable, isn't it, Swati? I think that would be a good idea to get back to those issues in the roundtable. Uh, we will move on to the first business session, which will be chaired by Professor uh, Mamunur. Oh, no, sorry. It will be chaired by, yes, Professor Mamunur Rahman, Department of English, Islamic University, Bangladesh. So I will hand over the the responsibility of conducting this business session to Professor Rahman.
Thank you very much, Chandrabha Chakravarti. And congratulations, Professor Josna Rege, for delivering so nice speech and setting the tone of this webinar. Doris Lessing, we have already been familiar with his anti-foundational, anti-institutional stance, so much so that she has been some sort of enigma to us. And Professor Josna Rege touched upon the main points that preoccupied Doris Lessing. And I am Mamunur Rahman, Department of English from Islamic University, Bangladesh. So this is the past business sessions of this webinar. And here are presents, besides Chandrabha Chakravarti and Josna Rege, Swati Mitro, Professor Ahmed Ahsanuzzaman, Ratna Raman, and many others with whom we already conducted meetings with a view to launching the South Asian chapter of Doris Lessing Society. And I think we will be able to live up to the expectations of Josna Rege, that the society is going to be the model to be followed by other chapters elsewhere around the globe. So in these business sessions, the first speaker is Professor Ratna Raman, and she is a professor from Department of English. Sri Venkateshwara College, Delhi University, India. And her title is Doris Lessing at New Delhi, the beginning of a journey in the 1990s. And this is, I would feel a bit glad to speak a little about his bio note. Ratnaraman teaches and tutors graduate and undergraduates in English at Sri Venkateshwara College, Delhi University. And her PhD thesis is very much relevant in today's webinar. That was on Doris Lessing. And she was deeply interested in women's writing, 19th century literature, the 20th century novels, Indian classical literature. She has a weekly column, Mind Your Language, for over 3 years in the Tribunes. She writes for newspapers and news journals and published occasional short stories. So this is Professor Ratna Raman, and we would like to hear her experience about Doris Lessing. So please, Professor Ratna Raman.
Thank you, Professor Rahman, and I will thank you for welcoming me. And the only thing that I realized I didn't have on this list was the fact that I presented a paper at the first International Doris Lessing Conference at New Orleans. So let the records, hold that also. Okay, so I will begin my presentation. So, as Professor Rahman just pointed out, Doris Lessing at New Delhi, Beginnings of a Journey in the 1980s is the title of my paper, which sounds like it's going to introduce all of us to a point where Lessing was really at New Delhi. However, Doris Lessing straddled continents. She was born in Asia, came of age on the African continent, and then returned home to England, where her parents and sisters had mostly lived. Although the nuclear family of the 20th century had pretty much shaken off the mud around its roots as it settled firmly on new and alien gravel. Lessing lived in London for upwards of 50 years and traveled to different parts of the world and was eclectic in the ideas she engaged with as an autodidact. However, while she did briefly visit Asia, India is a place she never dropped in on. So the title of my paper, stroke talk, Doris Lessing at New Delhi, the beginnings of a journey in the 1980s, has more to do with my own engagement with Doris Lessing, pretty much in the way we engage with writers through their work and the significance it holds for us as readers, and the ramifications through which authors' stories are disseminated through time and space. At a lecture during the master's program in Delhi University in 1983, we met Margaret Drabble and her historian husband, Michael Holroyd, who was possibly unknighted at that juncture. After fielding questions about her novels, Drabble was asked about her friendship with Doris Lessing. She shared with us the information that her husband was to be the future biographer and that Lessing was planning to leave all her papers with him. Did that happen? Were Lessing's papers sent to him? Lessing lived on for another 30 odd years, and Sir Michael Holroyd is apparently no longer writing Lessing's definitive biography. And of course, we know now that the definitive biography on Doris Lessing is being written by Patrick French. In 1979, a little before Drabble's arrival, Delhi University had begun its MPhil program, and Doris Lessing's Golden Notebook was introduced as part of a course on the 20th century novel, along with writers such as Kipling, Salman Rushdie, and Virginia Woolf. Hers was the last novel in the list of essential primary readings. So even though Lessing never visited India before or after, her work had begun to travel, and she was significantly ensconced in academia preceding Drabble's arrival by a few long years. In the years inching past her centenary, it is extremely useful to examine Lessing's presence in India's Central University in the last 2 decades of the 20th century and her subsequent brief reign in the undergraduate syllabus at the turn of the century. We were introduced to Rushdie, Wolf, and Lessing in this course offered by Professor G.K. Das, who was also the in house E.M. Foster specialist. Uh, Lessing continued to be part of the MPhil program at the turn of the 21st century. What was the impact of Lessing's work on academia? How did her ideas contribute to the shaping of ideas at the university? What were Lessing's contributions to the 20th century novel, feminism, to the Indian reader? And before I set the set up the answers to the earlier questions, let me just briefly mention some of the references to India or the Indian subcontinent. In The Sweetest Dream, there is this conversation about somebody making tea and drinking it, and the fact that some woman on a hillside somewhere in India must have gathered those leaves. Again, there is a Sri Lankan woman in a bright red sari who's part of the conference. And in the text, The Cleft, in the novel The Cleft, there is a reference to these abandoned babies who are rescued and who have does that come and suckle them. And there is so much respect for these does because they feed the babies milk and nourish them that they're never hunted for food. And this is really, I mean, to my mind, it struck me as a mythologized version of the holy cow, since that is the status that the right wing in India offers to the cow. And this is probably Lessing's gentle nod to the idea of not killing animals that provide us with sustenance, perhaps. She engaged with Gandhi and with Hatha Yoga, which she practiced herself. And as Josna points out, she also uses the word Himalayan bloc. She also stopped at Pakistan on her way to meeting refugees from Afghanistan, where the revolution of 1978, which was an idea that had gripped the Occident as an emblem of great hope, was spilling over. Lessing was part of an organization that hoped to fund Afghan refugees without the money being siphoned off by middlemen. And she mentions in her book, The Wind Blows Away Their Words, written in 1987, she offers an insight into the lives of women, both ordinary housewives and military leaders, and the occasional skilled professional, about the generic roles played by men and women in this part of Asia. Okay. So her introduction to the canon at the university, however, provided a context that continues to be significant not only in personal memory but in enabling an understanding of the extraordinary inputs that Lessing and other contemporary novelists shared through the genre, namely their engagement with a world that was no longer firmly Eurocentric, one that was beginning to focus on the margins that were now occupying center stage because of the newly opened spaces of political independence in which new imaginings could be the form of the novel and its various narratives unveil the relationship of the English novelist with England and other English speaking parts of the world, and the heteronormative nature of relationships in the European world as well as in the worlds outside. All of these entailed an opening out and a resetting and a definitive shifting of canonical practices with regard to the methodologies of teaching and the dissemination of information. All these links and connections become a very significant way of exploring Lessing's work and influence in the context of one of India's central universities. Our MPhil program introduced us to the Golden Notebook 17 years after its publication in 1962. Other than the matrices of genre and race and class, it also engaged with psychoanalysis and Marxist theory, alongside the successful articulation of the dilemmas of women in the 20th century and the heteronormative spaces that they were being pushed into occupying, and the complex dynamics of living in a postmodern world. Lessing's Golden Notebook in the MPhil course at the English department heralded a new shift in academia. Of course, we read the stellar women novelists of the 19th century, George Eliot, Jane Austen, and Charlotte Bronte in our undergraduate years. And we reread George Eliot and Jane Austen with gusto when we did our masters. And yes, the old curriculum offered a token nod to Virginia Woolf's Lighthouse too. But predominantly, the English literary canon that we followed in the 20th century was one headed, enclosed, and defined by male authors who appropriated the female act of birthing by referring to their literary writing as their brainchild or brainchildren. I mean, for instance, Dickens, who engages with class and the crush of industrial capitalism, says this about his books, quote, like many fond parents, comma, I have in my heart of hearts a favorite child, and his name is David Copperfield, unquote. This is rich, coming from a man who fathered several children to whom he lent his surname in a patriarchal world. Strangely, the denial of the name of the mother in patriarchal history is then supplemented by the takeover of the term labor, appropriated from the surplus of the working class and the efforts of birthing women. The term labor is then used to imitate and replicate labor in the real world by equating the production of a literary text as a strenuous effort. How do we engage with this process? The symbolic world of language asserts its power over the real world and controls it through a system of science. It arrogates to male writing a creativity and an authority that is denied to women in the real world and in the fictional world. Meanwhile, in the real world, men born of women are required to be reintroduced in the symbolic order through various initiation ceremonies that enable an easy mediation between the real world and the symbolic order, which was also the spiritual order at one point. Simultaneously, women were forbidden to engage with writing itself because it was not sanctioned, and they could be subject to censure or derision if they chose to appear as writers in the public sphere. So the symbolic world of language policed women and shut them out as well, while the real world emphasized their inferior status. Small wonder then that George Eliot and the Bronte sisters wrote pseudonymously, since creative writing remained outside the job domain of women's work in the private sphere. This went on for a considerable period of time until its implosion in the 20th century, when this structure of control was first challenged by women writers of fiction and then articulated by women theorists. Lessing was born in 1919, in the century after George Eliot and the Bronte sisters, yet there was so much from the previous centuries that washed up on the shores of the 20th century. Despite a reshuffling of rules and a brittle elasticity in the laws around the right to divorce, right to young children, right to work, and so on, as well as the symbolic victory of the suffragettes, all these new spaces swirled around in the cocktail of colonialism and world wars and subsequent struggles for independence. Case in point, Isaac Denison, otherwise known as Karen Blixen, and Ralph Ian, which was Olive Schreiner's pseudonym, were two women writers who wrote pseudonymously about lives lived in foreign lands in the 20th century. I'm going at this point to leave Lessing right here in the middle of the existential tumult that could have been experienced by a 20-year-old in southern Rhodesia at the commencement of the Second World War and get back to the New Delhi of the 80s once more. The MPhil program at Delhi University was set up by teachers at the university who, having trained in research in the English and American academies, returned home to set up a space for study, specialization, and research in order to inspire, motivate, and facilitate homegrown scholars and promote scholarship. At this time, new critical reading that favored the close reading of the text for analysis was being run aground, and new ways of analysis by looking at history, biography, and engaging with new theoretical arguments drawn from psychoanalysis, Orientalism, structuralism, deconstruction, post-colonialism, Marxism, and feminism had begun to make inroads into classroom discussions. Our engagement with theory in the MPhil paved the way not only for newer readings of texts in the curriculum, but also in the reframing of syllabi in the 1990s. Woolf was brought into the undergraduate course, so was Afra Ben, Barrett Browning, and Christina Rossetti. And in a paper that engaged with women's writing in the 19th and 20th century, we had Asha Purna Devi, Ramabai Saraswati, rubbing shoulders with Florence Nightingale, Alice Walker, and Doris Lessing, where the Golden Notebook, a text we had read in our MPhil, was offered for unrestricted reading, discussion, and analysis to undergraduate students. The Golden Notebook had been around for almost 30 years by this time, and new roles and identities taken on by women who are now occupying positions in the public sphere were now visible in the India of the 1980s and 1990s. These were real women who had stepped over prescribed boundaries, very much in the way that Anna and Molly had made choices in the world of the Golden Notebook. Lessing wrote the Golden Notebook in the 1950s and projected a futuristic England of the 70s, prophetically outlining the lives of free women. The changes in India that were happening drew upon the bedrock of the freedom struggle in which men and women participated, and the fact that the written constitution of independent India drew from the British Constitution. Indian women also benefited incrementally from the many hard won rights of the women's movements in the West. As a third world country that freed itself from the colonial yoke, India's struggle for independence was joined by women from different parts of India who also fought over the strong stranglehold of caste, the lack of access to education, and the absence of rights and access to public spaces for countless women who were confined to the cultural compulsions of the private space. A small minority of women, educated perhaps from the elite and middle class backgrounds, lived remarkable lives influenced by white women who had plunged into the wide world as early as the 19th century and left behind a legacy of ideas and forward looking institutions. There was no dearth of such women role models in the realm of nursing, healthcare, education, and theosophy, such as Maria Montessori, 1870 to 1952, and she was in India from 1939 to 1947. Annie Besant, 1847 to 1933, she actually dies in India. Isabella Thoburn, 1840 to 1901, and of course, Madame Blavatsky, 1831 to 1891. She visited India from 1879 to 1885 and also founded the Theosophist Society at Adyar in Tamil Nadu. This is by no means an exhaustive list. What we have available to us in the Indian subcontinent is an actual record of the visits of several unusual and wise women from England and Europe. Madame Blavatsky was actually from Ukraine. And all these women, in their shaking off of the insularity of domesticity and the confining private sphere, actually managed to free themselves of these suffocating patriarchies of nation, race, and religion in their search for meaning. For me, as a student of literature, Mrs. Moore's visit to India and E.M. Forster's passage to India evokes and recalls the number of women who are engaging with other cultures. The elderly Mrs. Moore is also the mother of the annoying Englishman Ronnie Hislop, whose fiancée Adela Quested is also in India on a visit. Possibly, Foster's creation of Mrs. Moore, who is presented as a friend of India and is emphatic and empathetic at all times, was based on his awareness of the liberated fellow feeling nurtured by his female compatriots and his own knowledge of the various white elderly women who had visited India and had engaged with it exuberantly and in a non hierarchical manner. Yet, Mrs. Moore remains a kind old woman who dies as she leaves India, and Adela Quested returns to England and does not marry Ronnie Hislop. In a passage to India, some of the Indians do assert themselves. Foster allows normative heterosexuality to wobble a bit, but beyond that, the novel concludes in a homosocial space wherein Fielding and Aziz, characters in the novel, renew old bonds. This reminds me of, at this juncture, Doris Lessing's categorical refusal to be viewed as a wise old woman at a particular juncture in her writing. So what? So we must really look at what Lessing, as a lot of British colonials, brings to the novel form at this juncture. And in order to do this, we must return to the young Lessing, whom we left in southern Rhodesia. So, writing 20 years after A Passage to India, Lessing's short stories and fiction challenge the assumptions of male writing in her appropriation of what she defines as mainstream writing traditions and plunges her female characters into the political and cultural churning of the mid 20th century. Lessing's women challenge conventional norms, and Martha Quest undertakes an exploration that does not make her return to the place she started from, while Adela Quested journeyed from Europe to India and returned to Europe and England. Martha Quest journeys away from Africa to England. And Lessing's earliest sequel, The Children of Violence, traces the life of the adolescent Martha Quest in Africa and follows her unconventional life choices, many of which echo, uh, autobiographical references. So they follow her the sequel follows her unconventional life choices in a very public sphere and in a besieged world that is being bombarded by war, technology, and rigid hierarchies and hegemonies. In the Golden Notebook, Lessing sets up two narrative forms. One of the notebook, secret and private, like the lives of women are meant to be, and another that traces the life of two good friends in London. I mean, this is very significant because we are looking at female friendships in a patriarchal world that has always warned us about how women are women's worst enemies. We are looking at women's lives in the African bush and the city and in London and noticing the waning of religious power and its replacement with the energies of psychoanalysis and communism. In fact, for the first time in the 20th century, Lessing is allowing us a detailed look into the life of ordinary, small, personal female voices. Okay, I will use the word middle class women, and presenting a range of possibilities and choices and strong friendships and support systems that we saw very little of in earlier fiction. So, for the first time in literature, the notion of a lesbian continuum is being offered to us. Lessing also discusses sexual freedoms in the Golden Notebook and reveals to us the double standard that controls and runs women's lives in the absence of the pill that is made available. In the same year that the Golden Notebook is released, and coincidentally, uh, Mary Stopes, who lived and died between 1880 and 1958, and whose book whose handbook on sexual practices in marriage was the popular text at the time that Lessing was growing up. Her book was published 1 year before Married Life. Her book was published 1 year before Lessing was born. And interestingly, Mary Stopes dies in 1958, but Mary Stopes International, these clinics that are going to be looking at women's sexual and reproductive health, begins operating in New Delhi in 1978, 1 year before Lessing is part of the Delhi University MPhil curriculum. So, for the Indian reader, not only was there a book about women who led unconventional lives and who were exploring their sexualities, but also the International Mary Stopes office that was proceeding with advances in technology. So, the Golden Notebook, in that sense, provides a starting point for dialogue, for engagement, and also provides the possibility of plural, independent, and multifaceted women uh, who could provide a series of roles or whose roles would overlap the ones that were being enacted and lived by women in the more privileged spaces in Indian society. Okay, I mean, I think, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ratnaraman, for your insightful lecture. Professor Ratnaraman, she has touched upon very important points. That is how Doris Lessing was introduced in the academia and its ramifications at Delhi University and all over the other parts of India in that sense, South Asia. It's the very introductions of Doris Lessing along with others. It had its direct bearings on the spread of feminism, and that feminism influence had its further ramifications in the independence movement joined by the female citizens of India. So this is a far-reaching effect, and Doris Lessing's advocacy of the sexual freedoms, emancipations, individuals' freedoms, all these had its effects in the academia in India. So all this has been touched upon by Professor Ratnaraman, and we have been so much benefited by his lectures. So thank you again and congratulations. At this point, we have another valuable lecturer to illuminate us. That is Dr. Swati Mitro, and the titles of her lecture is Portrait of Ladies in Lessing and in Bengali Cinema. So the topic itself is very interesting because it is going to indicate upon new dimensions of studying Doris Lessing in relation to cinema and film studies. And I would like to talk a little about Swati Mitro. She is an assistant professor in English in West Bengal Education Service, and currently she is working at in Barasat Government College, Kolkata. And he is a member of the Doris Lessing Society. And she explored Doris Lessing's novels in both her MPhils and PhD dissertations. She has been particularly drawn to Lessing's use of multivalent narrative texts and poems. She presented papers in many national and international conferences, including Doris Lessing's second triennials in Leeds, United Kingdom in 2007 as a Charles Wallace scholar. And again, she presented papers in Doris Lessing Centenary Conference held in University of East Anglia, Norwich, United Kingdom in 2019. She initiated writing workshops in British Council, Kolkata, to commemorate Lessing centenary in 2019. And in the same year, presented a proposal to the Doris Lessing Society to begin a chapter in South Asia. And we know that she is very much active in opening. In fact, she took the lead and she engineered the launching of South Asian chapters of Doris Lessing Society. So this is very nice to hear from her experience and recommendations. So please, Dr. Swati Mitra.
Thank you, Professor Rahman. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay. Before I begin, I think I would like to congratulate Ratna. That was a blazingly erudite paper, I must say. And I would like to welcome everyone who is here, and a very warm good evening and good morning to Josna and whoever is in the far in the west. I would also like to welcome here Professor Radha Chakraborty, who is here, I think, who has also agreed to mentor the group, which is the chapter of Doris Lessing Society South Asia. And at the same time, my very warm welcome to Professor Devaki Jain, who is the inspiration here, and she has joined here, and I'm more than delighted. I think I begin the portrait of ladies from there, but we'll hear her on the next day, which is on Sunday. Uh, Before long, my proposal or whatever my abstract was, I I would just like to begin a bit of a screen share, simply because I feel that it is very difficult to hold on, and there are certain visuals, because since I'm going to speak on films, maybe a bit of visuals would help. So that being the reason, they are not going to be very elaborate visuals, but just to keep things in focus, maybe for me and not really for you. So just a second for that screen share, which goes with my title, which says Portrait of Ladies, Doris Lessing and Bengali Films Come Together. And that is how I would like to explore whatever I'm going to speak on first. for instance. Now, Lessing, as we all, I begin with the 1962 and not earlier, in terms of the selection of my films, which begin with the 1960s. And we already know that Lessing, she has introduced time and again a series of women who have been uh, portraits in their own way, and that's a range, and that is how I'm going to first put her characters. If we begin with the first, which is Mary Turner, at one end of a range, and if we can safely put Alit and even a wiser, older Martha in the second, in the final, in the other end of that range, then we find that one, which is Mary Turner, who is also, I would say, in the narrative a little left aside by Lessing herself, because she felt that here is the conforming woman, and Lessing takes up from there and explores the other women whom she feels could be differently suiting their times. Then Mary Turner is one end, and we know that she had conformed to that white colonial society of Rhodesia, South Rhodesia, which Lessing herself had rejected. And then comes our the most important, the most famous, that is Anna Wolf, an oblique resonance of Virginia Woolf herself. And Anna Wolf is a person who is struggling with, who has all those four journals, and who is struggling, as we know, with several things. But as in the preface, and as Anna herself points out from time to time, she is the proverbial, or not necessarily, Lessing's proverbial free woman, who realizes that she is not really free because she is still entrapped. And the entrapment comes from within, which is why the need to break it all up from within. She's entrapped because she is still dependent, as she realizes, on several things that keep a woman going other than just plain simple freedom. She has to take care of the child, she has to manage her finances, and for God's sake, she also continues to have emotions which were built and engineered in her by everything else that is life. And she is also dependent, as she realizes, sexually on men. So, in spite of all the freedom, Anna struggles in her entrapment, and so does basically the next, and the person, the other portrait, the other character, who is Martha. And we know Martha is the autobiographical Lessing heroine who began early, and we know how fragmented Martha becomes in the end. There are a lot of overlappings between Anna and Martha. We can talk about that at length. But where Anna stops and realizes, well, she just has to go back in spite of all the freedom and all her, perhaps even coming to terms with things. Martha allows herself to be kind of, she floats away as Lessing ends her narrative, not within the realistic but within the space fiction dynamics. And she allows Martha, the seer, quote unquote seer, to float away to some other, into another zone, just like Alith later on moves away to yet another zone. And Alith and of marriages and Martha, they become not women. As women, they realize the roles that they need to play and continue to play. But if they also feel entrapped, their freedom comes from their sense of, from the seer role, and the ability to and access to extrasensory perceptions, and which somehow offers them what the world without doesn't, even what their own culture perhaps doesn't, a sort of freedom, which Lessing tries in many ways to explain. And as Josna has already pointed out in her keynote, that it is the her exploration of Sufi, and there are a lot of literature explaining how Martha and the later Alit and all of them were more or less Sufi teachers who go on. So, what the Sufi teacher leaving the space, finding freedom, does not really go on to explain Martha, the flesh and blood character who was there, who was entrapped very much in her multiple roles, and also very frighteningly in the multiple persona which she constantly shifted between from time to time. And so this, I think that this is what Lessing was trying to do when she keeps some women, some of the portrait within the realistic mode, and then she allows some to shift away and kind of explore and posit some amount of freedom through other modes of experiencing. Um, the next, and this is the range, as I said, from Mary to Martha. If that is the range, then there are some very interesting figures in between. I've already mentioned Alith, but I think more importantly would be uh, the character of Kate Brown of Summer Before the Dark, because this is the character I am going to talk about when I talk more about the films that of which were made in Bengal from 60s onwards. Now, Kate, we know, is a middle-aged woman who is, uh, well, she is not really. We have seen in Martha before that middle age is where there is a crisis, because, and Kate herself finds this crisis because she suddenly realizes that she has been role playing, and and now she doesn't really have to fit into any of those roles. And so Kate faces a kind of crisis, which is an existential one, because she thinks that she herself has lost her meaning. And then Kate goes off into an adventure that fills up a summer in which she is a little free because her family has taken off for summer, and she finds herself, which maybe Lessing would like to call her true self, but true or not true, because these are very difficult and slippery terms. But what Kate Brown finds is an inner space, which is not extrasensory, but merely dreams an inner space which all women could perhaps seek to find. But what I find more important in this, in the Kate Brown resolution, is her bonding, not the Anna Wolf and Molly bonding of the Golden Notebook, but her bonding with a younger Maureen. And this is an, if many of you who have read Lessing, we know that Kate Brown is a takeoff from the Two Room 19, which is a short story which she wrote famously, where Susan Rawlings faces the same crisis but decides to go commit suicide. Kate Brown takes off from Susan Rawling, is my reading, because she realizes more worth than just what the role plays within society, within her family, within society was offering her. And that was what I am taking it from Ratna and pointing out that the kind of bonding which was not a part of the scripts that were available, the bonding between women, the possibility of such bonding, which Kate Brown uh, finds, and Lessing continuously talks about such bonding. And I'm shifting very fast to Canopus and marriages, where too she talks about such bonding between Alith and Debbie, one of the queen and the queen's uh, one a maid in zone 4, and they too bond, unnatural bonding, one would point out, but which becomes enriching. And this is perhaps the script that Lessing offers most strongly in all the novels that she go on to write. And I can go on talking about and touch upon, if I may, on Jane Somers, who also born with Maudie Fowler, who is again an unnatural, unusual bonding which nobody understands, but they seem to be very enriched. So with this kind of a thing, Lessing is talking, offering a particular script to literature which previously has been heterotopic, which has been about roles and the necessity and playing the roles. And also, if one talks about the 19th century realist novel, which Lessing also harks back to from time to time, and Dickens has been mentioned. So if we go back to the Victorian, we do know that women have always been split, like Anna and Martha, as the fallen woman and as the angel in the house, something which even Woolf writes about when she is writing, in severally, but also I think modern fiction, where she talks about the split in the woman, the modern woman, the split which has been very manufactured within primarily patriarchal um, culture. Now, having said that, I am shifting to Bengali films, and I think I'll just share a little later because it's distracting me. I'll talk about the Bengali films of the 60s. Now, what really happened in the 60s was this was a new nation just coming to terms with itself, and there were a number of ways society was changing. And we find a series of films that also Bengali cinema and Indian cinema was not brand new. It had begun in the 30s, and there have been a lot of very successful ventures. But what films like Ritik Ghatuk's Meghe Tara, Satyajit Ray's Mahanagar, and Mrinal Sen's Ekdin Pratidin, what they did was it posited the working woman in the Bengali, on the celluloid, and gave it some kind of a recognition and acknowledgement through their narratives. But I would also like to point out the narratives function different. Now, where Ghatak and Renaissance Ekdin Pratidin, it talks about how the woman is reduced in spite of her economic independence and economically viable position in family. They being the sole breadwinners in both their families, they are reduced merely as providers, which continues to be a patriarchal society, that they become providers, whether getting if it is not a middle class, if it's a working class, then they will provide by simply rummaging through whatever herbs they get to to feed the family. So in that case, although the economical viability of these women were merely seen in continuation as providers, where society continued to impose their regulation in spite of their supposed freedom, the free woman, they were not actually free. The Mohanagar, which is the most important of this lot, because it talks about the big city of this new nation, which gives so many opportunity for the woman, and where the woman takes permission from husband, from mother-in-law, from father-in-law, from all her in-laws, including her child, to say, may I go and work and provide for you. That woman is given permission, and she throughout it is a role she plays with that permission hanging on her. And if that permission is taken away, so when the husband says you don't really need to work anymore, resign, she carries, and he writes out the resignation letter for her and asks her to sign. Then the woman is free. She has enjoyed her freedom. She doesn't wish to give it away, but she is not free because she is somehow uh, she's compiled. She is by nature as if compelled to listen to the husband. And the entire dynamics and politics of this idea of woman's freedom is that the woman is free to go out and work, because it is going to benefit society and her family. Not society, but primarily her family. So this is a kind of entrap the work itself. And she also although she works, she must not ignore her family. She must rush back and do all that is required of her. And before she goes, she must do all that is required of her. She must never, family comes first, and she must never ignore it. And whether we like it or no, Ray also makes his portrait of Arati in Mahanagar conform to this idea of femininity, of the portrait of the woman that his audience wanted to see. So what I'm trying to point out is this is the time when Lessing is talking about freedom of women, about the entrapments of women, and her women are individuals, and they are talking about the individual's freedom, where one stage in life or one kind of freedom is already given. If we see, all of them are in a way free women, and that freedom did not come with any permission. They had been educated and they left home and found work or did not find work, or whatever has been their personal individual choices. So there has already been a level of individuation for Lessing's women. And what Lessing explores is how, in spite of that, women continue to be entrapped and continue to seek different scripts, because otherwise it becomes a war for them. On the other hand, when we are talking about the women in Bengali films, we realize that they are never individuals. They are always going to be, they do not even have identities. They are identified by their referential or their relational identities. I wanted to share, I'm not very sure because the sound is very bad, so I do not want to disturb this, but my reference would be to Parama, even to Charulata, a very important film made by Ray, written by Tagore, the novel that is, where the woman is seen in her relational, referential capacity. Now, relational politics, relational identity is something we are talking about at a time like, let's say, we are talking about um, at the moment in terms of when we are talking about the work area, like the offices and the companies which have these relational roles, and one talks about gender equality there and gender politics there. And Lessing herself does so when she is writing Jane Summers, when she's talking about Love Again. She does talk about relational exchanges between the older, the younger, the new, the old, the person who's started it all. But when one is talking about relational structures and relational identities in Bengali films, in Indian films, in perhaps South Asian films, one is talking about the only possible identity that a person has. I'm going to now talk about a film like Parama, which is made by Opana Sen. But before that, very briefly, I would also like to add something which happened which added and which becomes an appropriation of patriarchy in Mahanagar is, and as well as in Charulata because of the endings, is that the woman uh, who lives and functions within the permissive zones, um, she is also becoming more and more, and this is particularly true of Satyajit Ray, where the woman becomes the moral social conscience. She becomes some kind of a crusader, and this is very true of Mahanagar, where Arati has a very close bond with Edith, who is an Anglo-Indian woman, and she fights when she is ill-treated on on the basis of gender and race. And Arati fights, and she leaves and resigns the job. But it is some, and then the last scene is not really with Edith and Arati. It is with Arati holding hands with her husband and walking off. And her husband also, and she, when she says, do you understand, like, seeks his acknowledgement, his support of of her actions. So in this I find that women and what is their idealism, what is their way of fighting, even their bonding with other women is constantly being appropriated or seeking acknowledgement in films made very successfully, brilliant portrait of women uh, by male directors. It comes and it depends, and one has to wait for the 80s with Aparna Sen, who brings in Parama. And the clipping I wanted was from Parama, where Parama is referred to as Boma, and there's this particular scene where a lady from US who has come to visit says, "What is your real name? I Some call you Boma, some call you Bodhi, some call you Ma, some call you Kakima. Who are you?" She is Poroma, a name that is not even used. It is an erasure of identity which Poroma lives with. And then she is asked to become a subject of a photographer because the family did not wish to object to this, since the photographer was known to them. But when she goes on with the photographer and goes on to have a relationship, it becomes a scandal, and the same family wishes to throw her out. But Poroma withstands that scandal. She wanted to take her life and she tries. But the new life that she gets makes her realize that she is free from all her relational identities, and even from the man who has set her free, because she is free, because she has found her own inner worth and her own inner strength. So Poroma is free, but we cannot end with Poroma. And Upannasan herself did not end with Poroma, because Poroma is a single woman, a sole woman who had somehow had an accidental uh, affair with a person. She wasn't even looking for one, and perhaps even accidentally has found her worth. And so Poroma, for Lessing, the single woman finding her worth will do, because the point at which she begins is where more or less there is some sense of freedom. But for people who are writing or making films for an audience in a society where women do not really have a name but are always regarded referentially, that's the time one requires something more. And kudos to Aparna Sen, she throws on their face the bonding between the most belligerent pair under the universe, the mother in law and the daughter in law. And that is Paromitar Agdin, somewhere in, I think, 2000, so 20, or maybe a little earlier. So almost a decade or so later, when Aparna Sen herself has faced severe tirades for throwing Paroma on the society, a great mistake that she made. But Paromitar Agdin shows this daughter-in-law, mother-in-law bonding, and bonding not within the script of a daughter-in-law and mother-in-law, but they bond even more when the daughter-in-law finally walks out of breaks the marriage, divorces the son, but continues to have a relationship with the mother-in-law. Now, this is a different script which Opanasen provides, because, like Lessing, who had provided a script of bonding outside patterns, outside expectations, Apanasan also offers a script which of course Ekta Kapoor has played out completely and differently and made a mess of, but it has stood its time. It has found its worth. It has found its address and its audience. And in 2019, we have yet another film which is called Mukherjee Dar Bow. And as you understand, Mukherjee is a surname. Da is, of course, a reference to a kind of a reference as Dada, so a brother, and it is a usually a societal address to a man in a close society of among neighbors, where somebody is addressed by his surname with not Mister but a Mukherjee Da. And I'm elaborating for those who are not very sure about what a Mukherjee Da would mean. And Mukherjee Dar Bow is his wife. Now, who is the Mukherjee Dar Bow? Both the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, because both father and son are somebody's Mukherjee Dar. And they fight, and again there is an erasure of identity. And then they also it is up to the older lady to realize that I am, and the words are that I continue, I who has nothing, not even a name to myself, I continue to fight for that name which is not mine, and I continue to fight for that space which is not mine, because it's my husband's house and my husband's name. And for that name and for that space, I'm stopping a younger girl, a younger woman, and imposing the same thing on her. So this is a real Kate and Maureen kind of a bonding in a different order. So Lessing does speak here in a completely different sense, with all the dynamics of Asian, Indian, Bengali culture working through it. And Mukherjee Dar Bow ends very poignantly with the woman saying, or the voiceover of the woman saying, that she has no name, she has no place. Every time it's going to be a fight for her, because she would like to tell us a new story. And here the story about the new script. A new story where the woman will win, where the woman will not have to fight, but win. And the young filmmaker, who's Pritha Chakraborty, who's in her 30s, uh, has gone on to make, or rather, it preceded. Mukherjee Tarbo is more of a pop film which was released, but she made a documentary, a short one of a 25-minute or so, on silent voices. The Silent Voices is a documentary where she charts the lives of her mother, her sister, her friend, her childhood friend, who all had to crush their dreams and perform uh, me everyday work, where they could not choose a job or finance or any kind of economic space, or even any space for that matter, because they had to look after the home. And I would like to end here that the Silent Voices, which is Mukherjee's bow, which is all the women who are always caught in referential, relational identity and its politics, the Silent Voices also speaks about the work which is done by women in the house, which is unaccounted for. On Sunday, Dr. Devaki Jain is going to speak on Lessing, but she is most important because she has taught India how to count in terms of women's labor. And especially this very, very grueling lockdown, with no helps for many women who are working like us, who had to keep working from home and continue to balance all the work at home in a society which still does not think in terms of dividing any kind of work inside the house. Division of economic uh, wealth and uh, economics of family is understood by now since the 60s. but division of household work has not yet taken place. So once again, and there is yet another film, not Bengali, so I'm not even citing here, by Nandita Das, who also made the film during the lockdown, which speaks once again about women who are free more than you can be one can be, because they earn, they are economically viable, they have positions in and out of the house, they are regarded as established women, not even like the kind Dr. Jain will talk about, artisans, aides. No, but they are regular women doing regular jobs in, they are everywhere. And yet, when it comes to finding their own self, it is it is a major struggle for them. They cannot, at times I may also, I am such a follower of Lessing, but I still have to say this, that finding one's true self, like Parama, almost becomes a luxury at times, because one almost wonders where to put one's feet among the many roles which they in any case have to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swati Mitro, for your very insightful lectures. Topical bound. That is, you have touched upon that is women's freedoms as presented by Doris Lessing. You have discussed Anna Wolf's, then Martha Quest, Kate Brown's, and then the most interesting part to me personally, that is how the new women was being born in these parts of this world, in South Asia, especially in India, and in Bangladesh we also felt the ripples. And in fact, I am, and perhaps Professor Ahmed Hassanuzzahman also, we are very much fan of Satyajit Ray. That is, it is a household name in this part of Bengal, and clearly Rai's films and the films that you have mentioned, that they reflected the social sense, and you have seen that social sense from the lenses presented by Doris Lessing. So while in this webinar we are analyzing Doris Lessing from South Asian lens, you are undertaking the other way around, that is judging South Asian society from Doris Lessing's lens. And it is particularly also interesting, that is how the directorship makes the story, the male directors and female directors. I have taken particular interest in this part. So in this way, both Professor Ramons and Ratna Ramons and Shati Mitro, they have made these sessions very meaningful, insightful. The suggestions and the recommendations, it will echo in our heart in futures. And Professor Ratna Raman spoke about the syllabus in Delhi University, in other parts of India. And as Professor Ahmed Hassanuzzahman also knows, that is the same thing was happening in this part of Bangladesh. Doris Lessings began to be reflected in the undergraduate, graduate syllabus, and there are many researchers who are doing MPhil and PhD research on various aspects of Doris Lessings in the universities in Bangladesh too. So all these are very interesting, very insightful, and on the back of it we have Professor Josna Rege. So we are also very interested in her lectures, path findings. He has given us some suggestions and directions. So I think so far this webinar has been very much meaningful, insightful, and left us many implications which we are going to follow in the coming days. So thank you, all the resource persons. Now, according to the schedules, programs, we have a few minutes for for interactions. So I would like to invite your comments and suggestions in these sections of the sessions, please. If any one of you have anything.
May I?
Please, Professor Ahmed Hassanuজ্জামান.
Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate the Professor Ratna and Swati as Josna Abbe has been highlighting throughout our presentation. Both were gripping and really insightful. So thank you once again for the presentation and for focusing upon different aspects of Lessing, of the Lessing study, as well as how Lessing could be read in relation to films produced in Bengal, particularly. Uh, Professor Ratna was, trying to talk about how Lessing is useful in demarcating the space, or how Lessing could be perfectly used to showing new spaces for women in South Asia, especially in India. Well, as I was listening to her talk, I got reminded of this book. Maybe Swati has seen this book. It's Pinjore Bushia, right? Kolani Gupta. And this is, Pinjore means parrot, bird, and it's a kind of a cage bird. And women have been presented as cage bird in mostly in the 19th century narratives by Bengali women, and how that space and how it matters, and it always keeps on reminding of wolf, women doesn't have any country, things like that. So how you could use Lessing or female writing produced in 19th century Bengal or other parts of India to redraw spaces for women. So that was really wonderful, Ratna, for focusing on this aspect. Swati, for your presentation, you obviously talked about, you tried to conceptualize Lessing, and also how Lessing is a kind of a, not going to influence, but how our directors or our filmmakers projected issues which are there in Lessing's novels. But you kind of looked at the films produced in the 1960s, and that was a kind of a high time for Bengali movies, because we have the likes of Chaudhary Ray and others, and also we have some other brilliant, gifted, uh, directors, cinematographers, etc. But I think we should also need to consider the influence states theater, especially Bengali Bible theater of the 50s. And this reminds me of Bohuruppi and the production of Doll Souls. And it has kind of a great impact on the culture activist of the time, of the period. And also, one should be reminded of the production of Rakto Korobi by Bori once again. And in Rakto Korobi Tagore, you have this free woman, right? So, what is she doing? She is, in fact, she is free, she's a free agent, and she's also emancipating the king who remains behind, who is not seen, who is not visible. So it's a kind of a, it's a kind of a entry into the guarded territory, and she's trying to kind of bring life into the dark world of the king. So you can see, we can see this presentation in our theater, in our literature. So I think this should be, yes, fine, that is over 60s film kind of negotiation, but we need action. But I like the presentation. I like your paper, Swati, and also Rutna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed Afsanuzaman, for your valuable comments. In fact, it may be said that you have been a kind of discussion on these two papers and very much relevant to these sessions. And then may I invite any other who are present? We have Ujjaljeet or others who may pass some comments on this interactive sessions. Yeah.
Thanks, Josna, Ratna, and Swati. These had been wonderful lectures, and in fact, I mean, there are a number of things I have come to know through these lectures. A few things I knew already. One thing which actually intrigues me, and I would, I mean, I'm not commenting on any particular talk today, but about Lessing, which intrigues me is the final interest which she had, that was Sufism. I think the relevance of this South Asia chapter, in fact, is is enhanced even more because of Lessing's interest in Sufism. And as we all know, that Sufism, in spite of the fact that it originated in Persia, actually it flourished in India. And I feel, I mean, the relevance of Lessing in this country, considering its diversity and Lessing's interest in fragmentation, and then Sufism as an answer to this problem, I feel, I mean, the relevance of Lessing is ever more in our current times as well. Uh, Another thing which I wanted to ask from Swati, in fact, I wanted to ask this personally, was that could she, I mean, refer these titles of these films to us, and particularly if they are available in Hindi as well, or I mean English, if we can also watch these movies. And definitely, I would like also like to see these films. So that was what I wanted from Swati personally. But yes, if
Hey, Ujjal, I just realized, or rather came across, a Hindi dubbed version of Parama, which
okay,
I think you'll get on YouTube. The
okay,
others, all other films have, they are subtitled, very thoroughly subtitled. So if you, the other films you have to just watch on subtitle. But Parama, incidentally, I came across. I guess people are watching it more now than before. So that was interesting on my part. I mean, I just came
okay.
across it. And since I'm speaking, I might as well thank Sir Ahmed Asanuzaman for pointing out the theater bit. Obviously, I couldn't talk about theater. This was not, the scope wasn't such. But I absolutely agree that Bengali films owe a lot of its sensibility and sensitiveness to the theater, which was on, which was also, and something which is almost out of date here is Lessing's, at the end of the day, a very leftist study and leftist ideal, perhaps construct, and there have been a lot of views on that. And you, Professor Ahmed, you know that the theater then, that the one you're talking about, was wholly leftist, a little out of fashion now. But it cannot, I guess, you can't really undermine what it has done to framing a lot of ways in which one thinks. But I'm very hopeful it's not going to last very long.
Thank you. Oh, yes, please, Professor Ratnaraman. Please,
Oh,
please.
I just wanted to add to something that Ujjwal said. As a matter of fact, I wanted to end my paper saying that, if Doris Lessing had come to New Delhi, we could have taken her to Nizamuddin.
Yeah.
Because there is an amazing syncretic Sufi tradition that has been there for a very, very long time, but she didn't. What happened was I was trying to connect to the conference and I just lost my entire paper. So then I begged the computer and said, please give something back to me. And it said, okay, I've collected something for you. Do you want it? So I said, yes, please. So, I mean, this section went out of the paper and got lost as well. And I just wanted to say to you, Swati, that, Lessing signs out of the Communist Party, 1957, okay? And she says 57, 58, and she says in the 80s, she says, I think we were all put here for a purpose. So to my mind, her engagement with the left is something that, ends even before she publishes the Golden Notebook. So it's some other sphere that she moves on to. Yeah, sorry, Josna. Speak.
No, thank you.
You're muted.
Muted.
Muted just now.
Josna, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now it is okay.
So I wanted to pick up, first of all, what Ujjal said, what you said, Ujjal, about Sufism. Similarly to what Ratna said, I had a section that I cut out thinking that my talk was going to be too long. Actually, it was too short. But it was a section on how the way Lessing approaches things can be used to overcome polarization. And so anyway, I think that the Sufism and the syncretism is very important at this moment in time, worldwide really, but certainly in South Asia. I also I had a couple of questions, one for Swati and one for Ratna. Swati, I was wondering, that room 19 where the woman kills herself is so heavily anthologized. I mean, if nobody knows any Lessing in this country, in the US, they know To Room 19 because it's in the Norton anthology. And so, it gets routinely taught by people who haven't read any Lessing. And then they don't necessarily know Summer Before the Dark. So I was wondering, whether it might be fruitful to look at that pairing in a comparative frame, the pairing of a woman who feels that everything is empty and meaningless and there's nothing behind the roles, and then commits suicide, in contrast with what happens with the sort of changes that the woman goes through, and the ways in which she is equipped to return. She has the inner resources to return to her life with a difference. And I think that we can see over time, female characters in film, certainly in I'm not so familiar with film, but in novels by women in India, where we see that development. We see the hopelessness, and then later we see a real change of worldview, a real change of attitude, which the female character brings back after a crisis, brings back to the situation. So I thought that might give you scope for more comparison. Anyway, just a thought, because you had so many different characters. It was really great the way you showed the continuum of the Lessing female characters, different ages, different stages in life, different ways in which they responded to the crises that they faced. So I love that.
Thank you, Ratna. Thank you, Josna. I was actually, that is exactly what I was trying to point out, that where To Room 19, even whether the author or the person both fail to find the alternative to the entrapment,
Right.
Kate Brown had definitely found another space, whether inner space, whether the seal which she carries. If you remember the narrative, the novel, she talks about a seal which she is trying to carry in her dreams, and then she manages to carry that the seal over to safety, and that is very symbolic of the soul or the seal, or the kind of play on the words. So I really felt that and Lessing, as
you made that point.
that is what I was thinking, that she does revisit her old short stories from time to time to revisit the same idea, and we do come across things very differently, and which shows a point of growth and a change in direction, perception, some another script maybe which can be offered to women who are entrapped, or anybody for that matter who are entrapped.
Mhm. Yeah. So whether you can then bring that out, that sort of shift to it, film heroines, that would be interesting to see. Ratna, I wanted to ask you,
Trying to
just
imagine
20 years that you were in,
with
and then the Golden Notebook. I mean, nowadays,
I
I
honestly
mean,
have not
taught Golden Notebook to undergrads. I know some of our colleagues in the Doris Lessing Society have, and bless them, but I wonder whether you can comment on the
two things.
MPhil
One, the difference
response and the undergrad response, and two, whether you notice any shifts in time over time between responses earlier on and responses today, whether that book is, if we had control over the syllabus, whether that is even the book that you would be teaching. I personally teach memoirs of a survivor most often in my undergrad classroom.
That's very interesting, because if somebody asked me, I'd say, why don't we have Matha Quest? As a matter of fact, Matha Quest for some time was part of the MPhil curriculum, and this was when I went to conduct a seminar because I was doing research on Lessing, early 21st century. So there's this girl who turned around to me and she said, so what is it that Matha Quest does? So why should we read her at all? So I was an MPhil student. So I said, what is it that you would like her to do? Would you like her to kill herself, like Marx does in the bell jar? Is that the solution you're looking for? And then this girl was a little taken aback. I said, finally, here is a young woman who's in her 20s, who's grappling with her own sexuality, with the war, with parents, with hostility in the domestic sphere, trying to make her foray into the public sphere, create her own network. I said, that's a lot for her to process and for us to process as well. So I'm not very sure, Josna, somebody came up to me and said, maybe I'd say, let's have the grasses singing because it's her first novel. But, there is something truly liberatory about the Golden Notebook. And yes, it's a voluminous book, but it's not a frightening book,
No.
It's not Ulysses, for heaven's sake. Okay.
But how do the students respond?
Nobody needs to beat themselves up with a copy of the Golden Notebook. So I'll tell you what I used to do. I used to tell them this book, it's like 2 sets of books. And I said it's actually much more. It's one book which has been sort of hidden between notebooks. So I would, distribute the reading to them. So I would say, okay, one set of you will do the black notebook, one set of you will do the yellow, or the blue and the red, and then one set and we'll do the free novel. And very often I take the free novel for myself. So then we would start discussions, and students made the most brilliant presentations. And some of them are hooked up. And there's a student I was trying to contact who for some reason has gone into a sulk. But he's read everything that Lessing has written. And this came out of my undergraduate lectures at college. So it's been a very exciting and very exhilarating space. So, the world that she keeps saying a novel about the mid-century that must be written. The Golden Notebook is that. It's that novel about the mid-century which desperately needs to be written because, where are the women? Where are the anxieties that we recognize? So I find it a very exciting book. So I've gone back to the MPhil and discussed the Golden Notebook in seminars as a teacher. And I've gone back and discussed Matha Quest. I've also discussed grasses singing. But I'd root for the Golden Notebook as a teaching text. It is a teaching text, and it is in many ways the magnum opus of not Doris Lessing, but the women's movements of the 20th century. And since you and Swati were talking about Room 19 and some of it for the rock, let me introduce yet another text to you, which I find very compelling. This is a fifth child. It's the same story.
Yeah.
Woman in a marriage, and kids and success, and then she wants this other child. This other child is what nobody expects. The child is autistic and she doesn't know how to deal with it, and the autism of this child just breaks up the entire family, you know. And then finally she tries to put the child. It's just like, you know, this is a living trauma for anybody to whom it can happen. And I was just thinking that we've moved so far away, you know, from those women who might or might not commit suicide, who've already been the heroines of the 19th century. So this is not your Emma Bovary, this is not your Anna Karenina, this is your central Lessing protagonist who's saying grace under pressure. And I find that extraordinary, you know. So that's another teaching text. I'd love to teach the picture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. So this has been a very lively talk at this stage of the programs. We are quite enjoying it. And we have one Mr. Amir Hussain who has posed a question in the chat box. He wrote, the talks on Lessing that you are sharing now is very informative and time-oriented. But the problem is that we have no ample materials on this writer right now. How sources on Lessing can be collected? So any one of you may answer the questions.
Is not Amir is in Bangladesh, right?
Yes.
I mean,
So then maybe you could speak to that. What resources there are available in interlibrary loans or various ways to get hold of Doris Lessing related materials in Bangladesh.
Yes, textbooks are quite available, but I think he is speaking about some critical discussions maybe. Amir is not available now, I think. So, okay, so
there are lots of Lessing essays on and journals if he's looking for criticism on Lessing.
maybe
He's asking for primary texts.
The library.
Yeah.
He is not responding right now.
Very well.
So,
okay. Yes, Butina Majul is saying that. All right. That's very useful. So I hope Amir Hussain will look at what Butina Majul has put up. Thank you.
So thank you. So we have Ratna Raman speaking about the entry of Doris Lessing in India. We have Swati Mitra, who has related Doris Lessing to the film studies. And we have Professor Ahmed Hassanuzzaman, Ibsen scholars, Ibsen theaters. He has taken part in the theater movement in Bangladesh and very much well-oriented with women's emancipations related issues. And we have Ujjal Jeet, who also raised
may I
interesting.
that we are moving on to the second session, which will be chaired
Yes,
by
sure.
Raman.
So, and finally, we have Josna Rege, who said the mood of these sessions. So from my part, I would like to thank you all and congratulate you. This has been very meaningful sessions, and we would like to switch over to the next session. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Chandrava Chakraborty. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Raman.
Thank you.
It has been a great session indeed.
Yes.
And the discussions were also quite, they were extremely enlightening for us. We are moving on to the second business session, which is the last session of today's evening. And this will be chaired by Dr. Ratna Raman. So over to Ratna.
All right. Chandra, I need to find the...
Yeah, everything is given in the abstract.
Yes.
Yes.
This is the session which has Dr. Subhajit Sengupta
And Ujjal Jeet.
and Ujjal Jeet. No, I seem to have a list of... no, I have something very different. I'm so sorry.
You don't have the conference program.
No, I don't. I'm not able
with
to
the concept note and conference program.
Yeah, okay, I'm just going to look for it. Give me a second.
Ratna, I'm WhatsApping it to you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Uh, Swati, isn't mm, I'm going to look at, yeah.
Have you got it?
Yes, I think I've got something. I'm just going to quickly scroll. I'm really sorry for this. Uh,
Yes, the first speaker is Shubham.
yeah, just a second. So sorry. Right. So we are going now to our business session, the second business session, which I'm chairing and doing very badly at the moment. But I just hope to sort of catch up and introduce the speakers to you. The first person who's speaking is Dr. Subhajit Sengupta, and his paper is titled Teaching the Grasses Singing in the Indian Classroom. And Dr. Subhajit Gupta is from Sengupta is from the Department of English at Burdwan University. So I'm going to say a little more about him after he finishes speaking, because I don't have those briefs with me. So over to you, Subhajit, and I hope you will put up with this very impromptu chairing that I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Thank you and good evening. And I'm afraid that the audience will also have to put up with something really terrible, because there has been a power cut in the place where I stay, which is why my face appears very dark and I have lost my Wi-Fi connection. And unfortunately, as luck would have it, this happened only moments before I was due to speak. This was what I was scared of the whole day. I had been fearing that this might happen, and this happened just before I was supposed to speak. So I'm using the rather unstable hotspot connection, using my mobile phone for it, but let's hope that the situation improves. Now, one of the reasons why I have chosen to speak on teaching the grasses singing in the Indian classroom is the need to articulate the sense of alienation and reconcilement that I simultaneously feel as a teacher born and living in a country whose independence from colonial rule is less than 80 years old. Now, this sets me at odds with teachers of Lessing in universities in places such as the United Kingdom or in the USA, for example, or in countries that have never, in other words, experienced colonialism as we have in India. And therefore, the terms of teaching a work such as The Grass is Singing to Indian students in an Indian classroom are very different from those observed outside the former colonies of the empire. Now, it is sad that the issue of classroom teaching, by and large, has escaped critical attention. This has led to an absence of connection between the pedagogical methods that we on the other hand, the research we do. Often, I have discovered with some dismay that the scholars, or that the scholarly and intellectual dimensions of research on an author like Lessing do not help much when I face my Indian students in the classroom. Now, while I have to devise strategies to impress on them the similarities and overlaps between the experiences of living and growing up in colonial India and in colonial Rhodesia, which was Lessing's experience, I also have to help them negotiate what I see as a tripartite framework of, first, India's colonized history, secondly, the students' and mine own post-colonial moment, and third, a white narratorial voice that is simultaneously colonial and resentful of the colonial enterprise. Now, this paper is not going to be on Lessing's "The Grass is Singing." It is rather an attempt to set the position that Lessing adopts as the novel's author against our present-day Indian experience of being embedded within the post-colonial situation, or our experience of what the post-colonial situation is, and the way that we remember colonialism from what we have heard about it from our forefathers in books that we might have read, and that includes teachers and students. Now, there are two ways of teaching or engaging with, even as students, of engaging with the humanities, or the disciplines within the larger category of the humanities. The older approach is the humanist approach, which of course is why we call these disciplines the humanities. And the origins of that go back some 500 years. But that approach was the subject of Edward Said's complaint around 1983, when he wrote a book called The Politics of Interpretation. And his complaint was that the mission of the humanities in contemporary American society, he was talking about specifically about American society and what was being done with the humanities in American society in the period. And he complained that the mission of the humanities in contemporary American society was to represent non-interference in the affairs of the everyday world, suggesting that engagement with the humanities distanced itself from world politics, from world affairs. But his complaint was probably too late in the day, for around the same time in the early 1980s, Stephen Greenblatt rather grandly announced the project of New Historicism, which touched a raw nerve and addressed the legitimation crisis facing literary studies. And simply put, New Historicism replaced the older humanist approach to the study of literature with what may be called a political approach, thereby tempering the severity of Edward Said's charge that practitioners of the humanities concealed and depoliticized the essentially unhumanistic process that informs currents of social, cultural, and political life. But Said's complaint, though rather ill-timed, was legitimate and pointed towards a gap. The gap was more easily observable before the mid-1980s, when Said wrote his book, than it is now. It is the gap that New Historicism, as I said, sought to fill. But what was at stake that was not so much an innocence or a classroom innocence about history and politics. If you talk about engagement with the humanities in the classroom, the interaction between teachers and students who teach and study the humanities, So what was at stake was not so much a classroom innocence about history and politics, but the indifference of students and sometimes teachers towards the lineaments of the connection between history and politics on the one hand and academic discourse on the other. Now, what can be disappointing even now, while teaching Doris Lessing's The Grass of Singing in the Indian classroom, is the students' disregard for the novel's connection to what I call local Indian realities. And local because these realities are Indian. And I emphasize that the novel has connections with these local Indian realities. Unfortunately, students generally don't recognize that when they read the novel, unless they are told about these connections. So that requires a bit of telling, a pedagogical strategy that would make students aware of their own involvement in the situation, or involvement in the whole discourse that a novel such as The Grass is Singing articulates. Now, the conventions of teaching, and teaching in the Indian classroom is no exception, allows teachers and students alike to neutralize the meanings, particularly the political meanings, that are inherent in a literary text such as The Grass is Singing. It allows teachers and students to pass over, to ignore the immediate cultural, social, and political relevance, the cultural, social, and political associations with students in a former colony, but now independent country like India. Lessing's position as a critic of colonialism, we'll dwell on that a little, but Lessing's position complicates students' understandings of colonialism, complicates students' understandings of an oppressive white colonial culture, and invites revision of attitudes towards the white colonial culture, invites revision of their understanding of racism, invites revision of what may be understood as racial fear and racial antagonism. Response to Lessing in the Indian classroom, that this paper looks at The Grass is Singing, where the relationship between a poor white woman, Mary Turner, and a black native, Moses, becomes the ideological paradigm that offers a variant of conventional colonizer-colonized relationships. Now, poor whites, generally speaking, were poverty-stricken, underprivileged people in places such as South Africa. And we are told early in the novel that someone was stressing the point that the Turners were poor whites. We are told also in the novel that the poor whites were Afrikaners and never British, so that a divide within the white community is created very early in the novel, in the opening chapter. Now, Afrikaners were descended from Dutch settlers who had arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Now, what I'm trying to point out is the complexity of understanding that is generated by a British author, Lessing, making or marking an association between her protagonist, Mary Turner, and the community of poor whites, and emphasizing the contempt towards the Turners, that status invites from the more affluent community of quote-unquote British whites. But the complexities do not end there. For Lessing's own identity, and this is very important, for Lessing's own identity and political affiliations are also called into question. Now, Lessing grew up, she was of course born in what is now Iran, in a place called Kermanshah in Persia, and grew up in southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, as we call it today. And she stayed there until 1949, and then she wrote The Grass is Singing while she was in Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, but it was not published there. She carried the manuscript to London in 1949, and the next year, 1950, it was published in London, and she became famous. Her first novel gave her immediate success. 7 years later, Lessing returned to southern Rhodesia, but she was not really welcomed there, and that was because of the political views that she held against colonialism. And in 1957, a year later, she wrote a book called Going Home, where she talked of, it's a kind of personal narrative, where she talks of the difficulties that she faced on that 1956 trip. Now, Rhodesia gained independence in 1980, and between 1982 and 1992, Lessing visited Rhodesia 4 more times, and these trips are recounted in a book called African Laughter, 4 Visits to Zimbabwe, and also in her autobiographical volume called Under My Skin. And also in the second volume of her autobiography called Walking in the Shade. Now, the years that she spent in Africa, from her childhood to 1949, and then her later visits to Africa, they had a deep influence, as we know, on Lessing as she matured as a writer. Now, these are, of course, known facts, but what she said about the natives is significant. She talked about Africa belonging to the natives. This was what she wrote in the book called Going Home, published 1957. And she said that the natives had to take it back from the colonizers. At the same time, she qualified that statement by saying that a country also belongs to those who feel at home in it. Now, when I say this to my students in the classroom, they have a problem. Does that mean that those English people who felt at home in India, many of them perhaps did, we don't know how many, also had a right to declare that India belonged to them? It's a complicated position. Now, I can explain it to my students by telling them that this is a unique position that Lessing adopts because she sympathized with the natives, and it's not necessarily that we're going to agree with, and it's not necessarily something that we could extend and make applicable to our own condition and to the English who had been staying in India before India's independence. This is a very individual position that Lessing is adopting, but one that is not easy to explain to Indian students. And I say this because this was a question actually put to me by one of my students in the classroom, who stood up and asked me whether the English then could also think of India as belonging to them, because several of them might have indeed felt home in it, particularly those who enjoyed the theatrical shows at the Gaiety Theatre in Shimla. They might have, and wonderful garden parties in those days. That student probably had read that bit of history about the ways in which the British entertained them in India, particularly in places such as Shimla. And she specifically mentioned Shimla and the Gaiety Theatre. Now, undoubtedly, Lessing is one of those, therefore, who feel at home in southern Rhodesia. Let's go back to Lessing. To the extent that ever since Lessing went out of Africa in 1949, she has always regarded herself as being in exile. Leading people such as Sage Lorna in a book called Doris Lessing to talk of Lessing as unsettled. She says that Lessing is an expert in unsettlement. Judith Gardner, in a book called Rise, Stead, Lessing and the Politics of Empathy, has also something similar to say of Lessing. She calls Lessing a colonial, but a colonial in exile. Epigrammatic in a certain sense, because we have to reconcile these contradictions of a colonial being in exile. And she says that, like Sage Lorna, Gardner also says that Lessing's fiction is reflective of that unsettledness that makes her simultaneously an inheritor of imperialism and also an antagonist to imperialism. It's a complex identity, made further complex by Lessing's use of the English language in her fiction, use of the English literary tradition, use of her mother tongue, so to speak. But it's a very complex identity that we are looking at, which I'll return to towards the end of my presentation. But this position that Lessing adopts, a colonial in exile, an expert in unsettlement, strikes hard at boundaries. There are boundaries, there are political boundaries, cartographic boundaries, but also boundaries in our mind. Boundaries that we find difficult to remain clear of. Boundaries that always intrude upon our ways of thinking, and our responses to people, to situations, and to literary texts. But Lessing seems to be an author trying to erase those boundaries, and almost seems to be compelling us also to resist the stubbornness of those boundaries of the mind. The central problem, of course, that dominates The Grass is Singing is the problem of a white settler, Lessing herself, and in the book Mary Turner, dealing with the relations of oppression. Now, as I said at the start, this is not going to be a talk about The Grass is Singing per se, but more about the problems I encounter while teaching the novel in the classroom. So I'll focus more for my purpose on Lessing's position and how that position, or how Lessing's situatedness complicates the pedagogic exercise. So the central problem, therefore, in The Grass is Singing, or about The Grass is Singing, is the problem of how a white settler deals with relationships within what may be seen as the circumstances of oppression. There's also the problem of Lessing's inner and outer worlds, just as within the novel we have Mary Turner's fragmented self and her inner and outer worlds. Here also, so far as Lessing herself is concerned, we have the inner and outer dimensions of Lessing's condition as an exile. Now in Africa, she is a British colonizer with obvious sympathy for the natives. But when she is in England, which is her country, her within quotes, because she is also a colonial in exile. When she is in England, she feels herself to be in exile and longs for Africa and the African experience. So the inner and outer dimensions, the outer dimensions of her condition would say that when she is in Africa, she is in another country, not the country of her birth, not a country which she can call her own. And when she is in England, she is in her own country. But then the inner dimensions of her condition would contradict that. And in her writings in Africa, in books such as Grass is Singing, it is this duality and also at the same time this ambiguity of Lessing's identity that is very obvious, because Lessing works both as a colonizer working within the colonial experience and also as a sympathizer with the natives working outside that experience, and recognizing at the same time the limitations of colonialism. Colonialism, or a colonial society, such as the society that we see in The Grass is Singing, the white community, needs to be cohesive in order to retain its identity as a colonial society. It has to retain its boundaries. It has to retain its narrow boundaries. And therefore, cohesion is important. And that would mean that Lessing's act of stepping outside those boundaries disrupts that cohesion. And therefore she is a threat to the white community. She's a threat to colonialism itself, which made her return to Southern Rhodesia in 1956 so unwelcome to the colonizers there. But Lessing's vision is an extended vision. Not only is she stepping out of the boundaries of the colonial enterprise, but in doing that, she is also extending her vision in a way that allows her to see beyond what is within the boundary, or within those boundaries. And within those boundaries is the myth of superiority, of white superiority. And Lessing's imaginative act of stepping beyond those boundaries exposes the idea of white superiority to her as myth, and also what she realizes as a false colonial myth is the necessity that blacks and whites should be kept apart in society. They should never mix. And Lessing's act of stepping outside the boundaries of the colonial enterprise of the colonial community, and she does this imaginatively, of course, enables her to see these as myths. And therefore, Lessing is able to explore the possibility of relationships between blacks and whites, which, of course, in the days of apartheid, in the time that Lessing is looking at, would have been seen as very, very transgressive relationships. What is, again, rather difficult to come to terms with is the fact that the relationship that develops between Mary Turner and Moses is a relationship that develops not between simply a white woman and a black African, but between a white woman who is one of those weak links among the white settlers in South Africa, being poor and being dubbed an Afrikaner. So the novel explores the possibility of a transgressive relationship between that kind of weak link among the whites and the black natives. It's a convergence zone that Lessing complicates by raising questions about the racial identity of Mary Turner, which of course, the moment that she is dubbed a poor white, it becomes very different from the racial identity of Lessing herself. Now, this therefore creates what can be understood as chaos. Chaos in the external world. Two layers of chaos: a relationship between a white woman and a black man, and secondly, between a white woman who is a minority in the community of whites. Now, this chaos, which is chaos in the external world, chaos outside, has its effects on the inner psyche of the protagonist, Mary Turner, and results in violence and fragmentation, or in violent fragmentation of the self, causes a breakdown of the self, and also, finally, a breakdown of the relationship itself, and the black man kills the white woman, vindicating thereby the reputation regarding blacks that the white community was always trying to foreground. The blacks were constructed as murderers and rapists. 12 years later, of course, in 1962, when Lessing wrote The Golden Notebook, she dwelt upon what has since then been recognized as Lessing's theory of the fiction of inner space, or inner space fiction, which explores mental and societal breakdown. And in hindsight, that is capable of being applied to what happens in the grass is singing. But that not really is much of a problem when encountering students in the classroom, in classes on the grass is singing. What is important what's important is Lessing's identity, her dialectical focus, the correspondence between inner and outer realities, the correspondence between inner and outer selves, inner and outer identities. And it is this dialectical focus that leads to Lessing's exploration of the relationship between Mary Turner's mind and the world outside that mind. Rubinstein speaks about this profound, what is referred to as this profoundly dialectical consciousness that Lessing has. The competing codes within Lessing. And this, of course, has been central to interpretations of The Grass is Singing and interpretations of Mary Turner. But this is something that raises questions about the legitimacy of the concept of identity itself, and the uncertain and ambiguous quality of Lessing's identity, in a way, to my mind, delegitimates and perhaps even eliminates the concept of identity by exposing its limitations, by exposing its lack of boundaries, by exposing its ontological and epistemological and in a certain sense, its political limitations. Lessing is a British white. On what authority does Lessing speak as a British white. On the basis of what identity does Lessing speak as a British white? Now, of course, she can speak accurately, or probably she can speak accurately of her own unique experience, though even this may be contested. But she certainly does not and cannot speak on behalf of either the colonizer or the colonized. Her position as an expert in unsettlement or a colonial in exile is an uneasy position. And it is this again that is difficult to come to terms with or come to grips with, particularly for young students. But of course, that is what makes reading The Grass is Singing so challenging. Now, this position as an expert in unsettlement or a colonial in exile is uneasy, as I said, is an uneasy position, and this position has the potential to get trapped in its own ambiguities and contradictions. It also has the potential to trap students in ambiguities and contradictions. In one sense, of course, no one knows the predicament of the colonized, their situation, better than the colonized themselves. And as we read The Grass is Singing, we somehow get the impression that Lessing, metaphorically speaking, swims in the stream of the native's experience and produces the illusion that somehow she has successfully done that. And may I here refer to a concept expounded by Clifford Geertz in his book, the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, in his book, Local Knowledge. Of course, he's better known for the interpretation of cultures, but this is a book called Local Knowledge, where Clifford Geertz says that people sometimes use experience near concepts spontaneously. Experience hyphen near. They might not have experienced certain things, but when Geertz talks of people using experience hyphen near concepts, he is suggesting that without having first-hand experience of a particular position or particular situation, a person can still empathize with those who have actually had that experience and therefore, in a way, come close to that experience. This is what for Clifford Geertz is the experience near concept. And he says that people use experience near concepts spontaneously and unself-consciously and colloquially. These are words that Geertz uses. People use experience near concepts spontaneously, unself-consciously, as it were, colloquially. And Lessing probably is doing just that. Her position as a critic of colonialism, and this brings me closer to the end of whatever I had to say. Lessing's position as a critic of colonialism complicates students' understandings of colonialism. It complicates students' understandings of colonialism as oppressive, as uniformly oppressive, because Lessing herself is part of that colonial community. Her ambiguous identity is what complicates students' understandings of colonial culture, of white colonial culture as being unambiguously oppressive. That understanding is challenged as one reads The Grass is Singing, and therefore the novel invites revisions of attitudes towards white communities, a revision of attitudes towards, as I said earlier, racial fear and racial antagonism. it's more to do with individuals then than to do with a race. That is the impression that we are eventually left with. Can a novel like The Grass is Singing, which is about a period of colonial rule, be accommodated within post-colonial studies? Post-colonial studies is a large and varied spectrum of intellectual enterprises, and I'm not very sure of this, but my thinking is that what post-colonial studies initially set out to do has been already done. In other words, the term itself has become to seem a little dated because it has outlived its utility. The subject matter of post-colonial studies, the methods of post-colonial studies, the historical scope, the time frame of post-colonial studies has expanded. And therefore, a novel like The Grass is Singing, of course, can be placed within the category of post-colonial studies, because as citizens of a post-colonial world, as teachers and students who have to contend with the identity of being post-colonial subjects, we are looking at an older text from 1950, which talks about equations between cultures, talks about oppression, talks about resistance and relationships. And I think, therefore, while teaching lessons, The Grass is Singing in the Indian classroom, among the various things that we need to talk about, of course, we could bring in feminist approaches to the text and a whole lot of other approaches as well. But I'm talking of problems here. And for me, the two major problems are coming to terms with Lessing's identity and the relationship between that identity, or the ambiguity of that identity, and the student's understanding. And secondly, this question which I very briefly addressed at the end of the presentation, the scope of post-colonial studies and the possibility of The Grass is Singing being, of course it can be and probably has been included within the scope of post-colonial studies. I'm only questioning that. What exact limits of post-colonial studies further? But these were preliminary thoughts that I had when I was asked to say something about Lessing. I thought of, and in fact, Swati, who is my former colleague, also suggested that I speak on Lessing, or teaching Lessing in the Indian classroom, since I do teach The Grass is Singing. And these are the preliminary thoughts that I had, which of course can be developed, but into something more profound and more complete. But I leave the audience with these thoughts for the time being, and thank you for your patient listening.
That was Dr. Subhajit Senka, who spoke about teaching The Grass is Singing in the Indian classroom. Thank you, Subhajit. And since I couldn't say this earlier, let me now tell you all about the person we've been listening to. He's head of the department, and he started his academic career as a lecturer in English at the Piggy College in 1999. He also taught at Krishnanagar Government College and Vidyasagar University before joining the Bardwan University. He has a deep interest in European Renaissance studies. His doctoral thesis was titled Genre and Meaning in Shakespeare's Histories. He is a member of the Shakespeare Society of India and has been a member of the British Shakespeare Association. Dr. Sengupta has presented papers and published both in India and abroad. He has also been principal investigator in UGC funded research papers on Indian adaptations of the drama of Shakespeare and other European playwrights. Besides the European Renaissance, his areas of interest include 18th century studies, sports literature, colonial and post colonial studies, and studies in the interplay of literature and the other arts. Uh, so thank you so much. And since we had, I think, decided that we would have the discussions at the end of the paper presentations, I mean, we are following that procedure in the second session also, are we not? Nobody's responding to my question. Yes, okay, thank you, Jyotsna. That was the heads up. So I am now going to introduce you to Dr. Ujjaljeet, whose paper, The Free Women of Doris Lessing. Hello, am I saying something wrong? The Free Women of Doris Lessing, with a special focus on the experiential world of the Golden Notebook. And to update you at the correct time about Dr. Ujjaljeet, she is an assistant professor at the Department of English at Guru Nanak Dev University in Amritsar. And she holds a doctoral degree in the application of theoretical assumptions of systemic functional linguistics on the writings of Doris Lessing. Her interests and areas of specialization include stylistics, systemic functional linguistics, and text analysis of Lessing studies, language and power, syntax, etc. Along with her teaching and research duties, she also writes poetry and short fiction for literary journals and magazines. So over to you, Ujjwal.
Thanks, Ratna. Thanks. The most intriguing authors of 20th century. So the topic, as Ratna has already introduced, is The Free Women of Doris Lessing, with a special focus on the experiential world of the Golden Notebook. The Golden Notebook was published in 1962. The Guardian refers to the book as a radical exploration of communism, female liberalist Bible, and reviled as castrating. The book received a different reception from the male and female critics. While the female critics labeled it as the canonical text of the 1960s women's movement, the male critics were, on the other hand, troubled by its violation of the established canons of the fiction writing. Lessing famously rejected both. In the introduction to 1971 edition, published nearly a decade after the book first appeared, Lessing expressed disappointment over the reviews received by the book. That no one noticed its complex narrative structure, and the critics just reduced it to a tract about the war of the sexes and a trumpet for women's liberation. For Lessing, the central theme of the book is cracking up. She writes, but nobody so much noticed this central theme because the book was instantly belittled by friendly reviewers as well as the hostile ones as being about sex war, or was claimed by women as a useful weapon in the sex war. The present paper endeavors to see the validity of the claims which view the Golden Notebook as a gender document and the relevance of its formal experimentation by Lessing by breaking away from the prevailing styles of fiction writing. This paper is based on a functional stylistic study of the Golden Notebook. The methodology of analysis has been transitivity analysis by Michael Halliday, which is actually the grammatical counterpart of the ideational metafunction under systemic functional linguistics. But what I am sharing here are the findings of the study and not the grammatical evidences which help me arrive upon these inferences. The reason being the assumption that the 30 minutes which are allotted to me here are not enough to initiate my audience to Hallidaian methods and then discuss their application as well. So, therefore, I limit myself to discuss the results of my study, But at the same time, I would also like to provoke the interest of my audience to transitivity analysis as a very useful, explicit, rigorous, and reliable procedure of textual analysis. Okay, so for Lessing, the central theme of the book was fragmentation, a psychic fragmentation as a consequence of socio political fragmentation of our world, which is embodied in the fragmented narrative structure of the book and its broken amorphous writing style. When she tried to bring the attention of the critics towards this theme of the book, she was referring to the meaning encoded in the form. So, before moving ahead, let's first have a look at the unusual and complex narrative structure and style of the Golden Notebook. So, the story of the Golden Notebook runs into two parts and five sections. The first part deals with Anna and her best friend Molly Jacobs' personal lives and is titled Free Women. It forms the main narrative or the frame story. The protagonist, Anna Wolf, is a writer of a single successful novel, The Frontiers of War. And she is a very intelligent and sensitive woman who undergoes profound experiences of life and notices dichotomies, divisions, and hypocrisies everywhere around her which disturb her deeply. Thus, in order to put an artificial form to her natural, chaotic experiences, she records them. And she records them in four separate notebooks of four different colors: black, red, yellow, and blue. The second part of the book, which is titled The Notebooks, comprises of these four notebooks of Anna and documents her subjective experience of the inner and outer reality of her life. These four notebooks form the four sub narratives of the novel. Further, both these parts, Free Women and the notebooks, are repeated four times in the four sections of the novel. There is a fifth section also, but it has only Free Women and does not include the notebooks. Instead, there is an independent section titled The Golden Notebook, interspersed between the fourth and the fifth section. Also, all the sections are non chronological, and the content also overlaps with each other. Among the four different notebooks which Anna writes but does not allow anybody to see or read, the black notebook contains the account of her African experience. The red notebook contains her experiences with communism as an active member of the British Communist Party and her disillusionment with the same. The Yellow Notebook is a rough draft of Anna's autobiographical second novel, The Shadow of the Third, in which she discusses her relationship with Michael as literary representations, Ella and Paul. And then there is the fourth notebook, the Blue Notebook, which is a diary account of her thoughts, perceptions, and dreams. It also contains the details and contradictions of her experiences with different men, including Nelson De Silva and Saul Green. So, this is the structure, and as you can see, this is a very complex structure of the novel. And this is what Lessing was trying to orient her readers towards. So, Irving Hof of the New Republic, he calls Anna Wolf that rarity in modern fiction, a mature intellectual woman, and receives the Golden Notebook as the most absorbing and exciting piece of new fiction that he had read in a decade. The reason being that because it moves with the beat of her time, and it's true. But actually, what I find is that Lessing was not even with the beat of her time. She was much ahead of her times. Lessing's fiction, after the Children of Violence series, at a hindsight can be categorized as the postmodern writing. She, on the lines of Rola Barthes' Death of the Author, challenges the identity of the author as a source for deciphering the meaning of the text. Both her thematic content and her formal experiments can be referred in the writings of the postmodern authors. In the postmodern condition, Lyotard writes, a postmodern artist or writer is in the position of a philosopher. The text he writes, the work he produces, are not in the principle governed by pre established rules, and they cannot be judged according to a determining judgment by applying familiar categories to the text or to the work. Those rules and categories are what the work of art itself is looking for. For Lessing, the Golden Notebook embarks on change on the personal level, the political level, and the narrative level. And this change is stylistically substantiated through the form of the novel. Now, I would like to talk about why this book has been time and again referred to as a gender tract. So, one of the reasons for the critical biases in appropriating the book as a feministic Bible is that the protagonist of the novel, Anna Wolf, is a strong, independent, and sexually liberated woman. She's a writer by profession and a communist by politics, an intellectual thinking woman, having her own financial resources and political stances. This was a new exemplar set through Lessing's fiction. There had been female protagonists suffering their personal lives and familial problems, but never in English fiction had been a woman suffering for her political disappointments. A political female protagonist was definitely a new experiment in English fiction writing. The critics were baffled with this kind of a new female icon and were trying to appropriate her in some kind of tradition or template. It was then that they noticed that Anna was a writer and a disillusioned Socialist Party worker, the facts which were common to Lessing herself. Thus resulted the constant comparison of Lessing's heroine with Lessing, which turned out to be a further irritant for Lessing. In fact, many critics are focused on the autobiographical reading of the novel. Anna Wolf is considered Lessing herself. The Star, in fact, reviews the book under the title Doris Lessing Appears in Wolf's Clothing. In Cape Times, Nancy Baines claims that Anna has written Lessing's own epitaph when she says, this is Anna's statement, "Yet I am incapable of writing the only kind of novel which interests me, a book powered with an intellectual or moral passion, strong enough to create order, to create a new way of looking at life." Lessing gets peeved at this. In a personal letter to Paul Schluter, she writes, "This annoys me, not because it's personally annoying, but because it means people do not read what I have written in the right way. The right way to read a novel is as it's a thing by itself, with its own laws, with due attention to its shape, not with a reference back to possible autobiographical instances." The novels with writers as protagonists were written by other writers as well. Lessing describes this as the theme of our times. Because every major writer has used it. Lessing uses the trope in the Golden Notebook and then in the Diaries of Jane Somers. But in the 1971 introduction, she explains that she is not interested in a protagonist that is that isolated, creative, sensitive figure in Kanzler Roman. For her, the theme of an artist is not only a personal theme, but a political one. An artist's block, which the protagonist suffers from in the Golden Notebook, is not her personal problem. It's a political problem. It's the consequence of her witnessing the sociological problems around her. Anna Wolf says, "The moment I sit down to write, someone comes into the room, looks over my shoulder, and stops me. It could be a Chinese peasant, or one of Castro's guerrilla fighters, or an Algerian fighting in the FLN. They stand here in the room and they say, 'Why aren't you doing something about us? Instead of wasting your time scribbling?'" So, as a person, Anna Wolf is hyper aware of the subtlest form of reality inside and around her due to her highly active and critical mental faculties, but she remains passive and ineffectual in the environment surrounding her due to lack of external actions. That is, although she is extremely sensitive to her observations and experiences of life at the mental level, she suffers from lack of physical and verbal action in response to the reality. In fact, she is undergoing a writer's block. This, uh, this state of ennui against the experiences in which Anna has witnessed injustices, social biases, discriminations, affectations, and hypocrisy in the world around her causes her extreme personal anguish, which leads to her eventual cracking up, that is, mental breakdown. Anna's fragmentation is a response to the fragmentation of the society around her. She witnesses the contradiction between the pronounced and the practiced reality of the social workers, which leaves her disillusioned with the socialist work itself. During her African experience, she observes discrimination of every form based on gender, class, race, and sexuality. In her personal life, also, she comes across different men and women who hold misogynistic values and practice class and sexual biases. In order to give some form and order to these chaotic experiences, she divides her perception of these experiences into these four separate notebooks. Her cracking up is a consequence of both her personal problems as well as the injustices she sees in the society, a consequence of the lies, hypocrisies, and betrayals everywhere. But mere feeling and understanding of the problem, it does not absolve Anna of the guilt of inaction. So, from here on, we move to the term free women of Lessing. So, the title Free Women, it refers to Anna Wolf and Molly Jacobs. This title has also been instrumental in orienting the feminist critics in securing the book a foremost place in the feminist canon, along with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and Simone Beauvoir's The Second Sex during the women's movement of the 1960s. Anna and Molly are free in the sense that they are entitled to their political opinions and they can choose their sexual partners. They have female friendship in each other, which was a unique occurrence in extant English literature because this friendship is not due to only a common female experience, but rather this is owing to their common political beliefs as well. They are financially independent, have houses of their own, they have careers of their own. So, no doubt, they are icons for other young women as new age free women. But the title, it is at the same time ironic. So, Anna and Molly, while they are very aware women, they are conscious women, but they are not happy women. Molly is aggressively unhappy, and Anna is passive and morose. Lessing is conscious that freedom comes at a cost. The cost these women pay for their financial, sexual, and political freedom is mentally disturbing. And they constantly hire the services of Mrs. Marks, the shrink, whom they call Mother Sugar. Both women constantly vie for happiness in relationships. Neither Anna and nor Molly, and nor their literary representations, Ella and Julia, run away from relationships. In fact, they constantly strive for a man's love. Julia tells Ella to start going to parties to meet the suitable young men for a relationship. Also, Lessing nowhere rejects marriage and motherhood. The ultimate values that Lessing puts forward in the Golden Notebook are love, friendship, and motherhood. This sounds quite conventional. In fact, in the novel The Shadow of the Third, Ella is constantly jealous of Paul's wife, Muriel, and her stable family life, and then she realizes that uh, it is she who's the third heir, the mistress, the other woman, and her representation of Muriel is her own ego ideal, the kind of woman she wants to be. Jenna, Anna's daughter, she chooses a conventional school over a progressive one, even though Anna wants her to go to a progressive one. And in the end, Molly prepares to get married again. Anna chooses a new lover, and she chooses the career of a marriage guidance counselor. In the Golden Notebook, which is a replacement of all the four notebooks, relationship is far from perfect. They perpetually indulge in sexual and power combats and heal through this. For Lessing, marriage does not ought to be a perfect union in the conventional sense, because such marriage is a farce for operation. For her, relationships are not final products. They are processive interpersonal sites of mutual healing. The message which Lessing forwarded was that a man woman relationship is not settled for once and all. It's a constant exploration of self through each other, constant dependence, yet a perpetual combat. The brokenness or madness, which is again a trope of modern fiction as well as Lessing's fiction. So it occurs as the essential phase in the journey. The golden mean is not about finality, it is about perpetuality and pervasiveness. The next part that I would be talking about is the encumbrances of relationships. The ultimate message of the Golden Notebook is cooperation and not competition. The linguistic profile of Anna shows that she has been most assertive when she is either doing something with others or for others. Anna helps others due to the reasons of love, friendship, and compassion. And this kind of empathy and service to others actually empower her and help her deal with her own issues in a more effective way. The little things that Anna does for the man she loves are the feminine encumbrances which bring her joy and sense of power. I had taken out small excerpts from the text, but I'm not sharing them here because of the limited time. but there are definite passages in the text where we see Anna cooking for Michael, or Ella doing something for Paul. So these feminine encumbrances bring her joy and sense of power. In Free Women, Molly Jacobs was married to Richard Putman, but gets divorced from him after a year and a half. They have a 19 years old son, Tommy, from the marriage. He tries to commit suicide in a state of depression. He doesn't die but loses his eyesight forever. Marian is Richard's second wife after his divorce from Molly. Marian has three sons with Richards. After some years of constant suffering in the marriage with Richard, she takes to drinking. Richard had been insensitive, promiscuous, and condescending with Molly, and he does the same to Marian. So Marian takes to drinking. But in the end, Marian and Tommy, this is indeed very unconventional, but in the end, Marian and Tommy find love in each other. In fact, this reminds me another text of Lessing called The Grandmothers. Again, the similar kind of relationship that is there. So they find love in each other, and Richard goes on for a third marriage with Jean, his secretary, and a lookalike of Marian. And this particular instance, in fact, reminds me of Ismat Chughtai's Bhabi, the short story. But anyways, maybe some other time. The passage below illustrates their newfound reconciliation, cooperation, and tolerance. So the passage goes like this. Marian and Tommy, paid for by Richard, went off to Sicily, taking with them a large number of books on Africa. They intended to visit Dolce to find out if they could, as Marian puts it, be of any help to the poor thing. Do you know, Anna? I keep a photograph of him on my desk all the time. So this is Marian talking. So meanwhile, Molly also gets over her bitterness for Richard and invites his and Marian's sons to stay with her while Richard and Marian are away. She invited Richard's sons to stay with her. Richard was delighted, although he still blamed Molly's life for his son's blindness. Molly entertained the boys while Richard went to Canada with his secretary to arrange the financing of 3 new steel mills. So this is towards the end that Molly also reconciles the fact that Richard has now another life, but without any bitterness in her. So in the last scene of the novel, Anna draws power and inspiration from her motherly duties, and meanwhile, Molly and she rely on their unconditional friendship, but without hindering each other's individuality. Meanwhile, Janet, Anna's daughter, too spends time with her friends before coming back to her mother. Thus, a network of social relationships is construed without any undue liabilities. So from here on, I would move on to the central theme, as Lessing pointed out, the fragmentation. But before that, just give me 1 second to put my laptop on charge. Okay, so Anna suffers in her personal life and suffers on account of others suffering around her. But she is fluidic and empathetic, which allows her to change. She suffers cracking up as a result of a cracked up world order. In fact, Lessing has taken the subject early enough in her first book, The Grass is Singing. But The Grass is Singing was a conventional book. The protagonist, Mary Turner, in The Grass is Singing, was a conventional woman. She also observes injustice and hypocrisy around her. but she closes herself inwards and divides herself from the bush and the blacks living in the bush, both. She too suffers madness, but her madness remains her personal problem and she perishes under the weight of it.
It's time.
In the Golden Notebook, once again, the issue of fragmentation is taken up on a larger canvas of gender, race, class, sexuality, and communism. The book, through its narrative form, style, and theme, forms a powerful statement against the divisions and fragmentations in the society. Further, while the grass is singing ends with death and disaster and thus serves as a warning note against the issue, the Golden Notebook seeks to offer valid solutions also in the form of human to human bonds of love, friendship, and cooperation. Thus, the Golden Notebook provides answers to the questions which were raised first in The Grass is Singing. While The Grass is Singing ends as a tragic story, the Golden Notebook forms a story of learning and resurrection. Anna of the Golden Notebook is meant to survive not only her own problems, but she must also present a new solution for this world. Anna does not see herself a mere gender victim. She represents a larger, cracked up world where oppression is not based just on gender, but there are issues of class, race, sexuality, hypocrisy, and double standards. The novel fundamentally deals with the problem of the critical versus the normative. Anna represents the critical and the rational. Nowhere in the text she falls prey to social biases and prejudices. Her judgments are her own. They are required by objective observation, rational evaluation, and instinctive human empathy. Her behavior is either a consequence of her sharp mental faculties developed through her myriad life experiences, or else she is instinct driven. She breaks free of the indoctrinated conventions of the Socialist Party when she finds that the members of the party are unable to see and discuss the shortcomings of the party from within. Nowhere Anna lets herself become an instrument of an indoctrinated ideology. Her instinctive behavior is particularly seen when she loves a man or in her role as a mother or when she helps others. In the end, she gets her salvation in the realization that the personal cannot be separated from the political. She could not seek sanity in isolation from the social realities. Thereafter, she does away with the four notebooks in favor of one single golden notebook. To achieve the golden mean of her life, despite all the betrayals, she once again becomes open to human bonds of love, friendship, and mutual cooperation. The encumbrances of relationships are upheld once again in the end. It is asserted that freedom is not in isolation, freedom is in togetherness. Thus, the core thematic issue of Lessing's fiction is that different people do not fight their own separate and personal battles. Rather, there is an underlying similarity between all these different problems. Dividing people on their pains and struggles is a strategy to keep them singular and disempowered. It's important to view the issue as a single, larger issue of an oppressed fighting against the oppressor instead of a gender problem, a race problem, or a class problem, and so on. The strategies of subjugation employed by a dominant group or an individual against the dominated are often the same across the divisions
Well,
of gender,
you have exceeded your
class,
half an hour.
and sexual orientation. An oppressor is not man, not white, and not European or even straight. He is simply normative. The one who upholds the cultural ideals of the mainstream group and do not leave any space for the individual assertion or free will. The compliance and conformity are his only goals. It is important to understand and explore these strategies at the outset if there is any inclination to counter them. Thus, in the introduction to the Golden Notebook, Lessing admits, yet the essence of the book, the organization of it, says implicitly and explicitly that we must not divide things off, must not compartmentalize. Thus, finally, labeling the book as a gender tract would be indeed reductive. The book has large issues of gender, humanist concerns, but at the same time, Lessing succeeds in making a powerful feminist statement also, because the harbinger of change this time is a woman. And this woman is not closed in her personal romantic world. The personal for Anna Wolf is indeed political. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so uh, thank you, Ujjwal. So we've had two presentations in this. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so we've had two presentations in this second business section in which we've looked at Lessing's first full-length novel, or in which Subhajit Sengupta has looked at Lessing's first full-length novel, The Grass is Singing, and Ujjwal has looked at Lessing's fifth novel, The Golden Notebook. Subhajit Sengupta has presented an argument about The Grass is Singing, where he locates it as a text written by a colonial in exile, and tells us of the difficulties in teaching it in the Indian classroom, where students want to know how a British white woman can write this particular narrative, which involves the story of the black man as well. Meanwhile, Ujjwal gives us a detailed and close textual reading of the Golden Notebook, in which she locates the journeys made by the various protagonists in a very complex world, and throws up the whole space of complex relationships. In fact, Ujjwal is also answering some of the questions that were raised by Sengupta in the first place, because she is talking about Lessing and the construction of the narrative that she is constantly providing. Two observations that I want to bring up at this point. I mean, there is very often, when we are negotiating writing, and I'm addressing this to Ujjwal and to Dr. Sengupta before I let the house ask questions. When we are talking about a writer, and when we are talking about the fact that we are dealing with a human being who's using language and a system of signs and symbols to communicate a certain perspective, and this perspective, in the beginning, the word was with God, and then it's been stolen from God by the author. So that's really the space in which we are working. So how is it that we are going to look at this? So are we going to say, no, this person is not God, this person is very frail, this person is white, this person is black, this person is, colonial exile, whatever. I mean, we can think of so many analogies. And do we therefore operate with the cancel culture? I think this is just a question that we need to ask seriously. And Ujjwal, I mean, I listened to your narration where you spoke about Anna and Molly, and there was a point when you were very upset with Anna because you felt she was now very passive and not doing enough. What is it that you would have liked her to do? The second question that I'm very interested in asking is the fact that you're saying these are women who are free, and free is ironic, which is very true. And you say they're not happy. So, I mean, I just want to put this question to you. And of course, I'm quickly going to borrow a phrase from John Stuart Mill. He says these very useful things that are sort of very handy to carry around. And he says it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So, is happiness a symptom of being truly human? Or do we look at, falling back upon the romantics, perhaps without their solipsism, which the Victorians point out to us, do we look at restlessness and the need for change? And the fact that there is a constant flux in which we live, this is what our texts tell us, this is what Lessing's text tells us. So, what is the value that we are meant to, or we should try and take away from that? Okay, so that sort of concludes whatever chairing. Now I'm very happy to throw the question, the papers open to the house.
I guess I'm supposed to answer the question.
I mean, you don't have to. I mean, these are just observations, really, that I was making. But if other people have questions they'd like to ask, I mean, the floor is yours anyway. yours and Dr. Sendukar's.
I would like to say something here. The first thing was that you observed that I said that Anna was passive. So this is basically what I find is that the Golden Notebook is a journey of learning, the journey of becoming. It's a Bildungsroman. So Anna, initially, when we start reading the book in the Free Women, actually, Anna herself admits that it is the Molly who is the dominating, the aggressive, the vocal type. But Anna, time and again, in fact, I did the stylistic analysis of this. And I found that time and again she wants to say things, but she cannot. For example, in the literary representation in the Yellow Notebook, when Ella goes to a party on Julia's prompting, and there she meets Paul. In that party, there is some Mrs. West and there is Patricia Brent, and they publicly they humiliate her in a very subtle way and try to tell her that she is that career woman types. Ella has a lot to say in response, but she does not. And this is not once, time and again in the text, you even in her African experience also, when she sees Willie Road or Willie and Paul both insulting people. At one instance, she sees that they are insulting Mr. Boothby, who is the owner of the Mashupee Hotel. And in the other instance, they are insulting a waiter. Anna, Anna is a socialist and she is supposed to take stances. But in spite of the fact, Anna is unable to say, though she feels, she understands, uh, but she does not, she is somewhere verbally challenged. She sees Paul and Willie insulting Mary Rose because she does not have a jargon of political discussion, although she is politically conscious. And instead, they compliment her on her pretty looks, on her beautiful looks. So she sees this kind of objectification of women. In another instance, I found that there is some Miss Latimer in the African phase, and again, Anna sees that her husband uh, abuses her, is physically violent with her, but Anna sees from a distance. She does not involve herself into it. So, I mean, the book is rife with such instances where Anna wants to say things, but she cannot. Instead, what she does is she comes home and writes them in her notebook. But towards the end, we see a change in Anna. And in fact, that change, I feel, is the crux of the story. That how Anna is, it's not about just the four notebooks which are turning into one. It is Anna's fragmented self also turning into one. So that is what I feel about this passivity in Anna, which she gets rid of all along. And the second issue which you raised were that Anna and Molly are not happy. This, I guess, I mean, you talked about it yourself only, that happiness is probably excitement, kind of happiness. That is actually not the goal of life. In fact, I talk to my students also this way, that in this life, we have to suffer. It's not just, this mythical way of putting it, that we are thrown here as a punishment. It is actually true. We have to suffer on this. But what is power then? The power is choosing your own suffering. So the difference between an oppressed person and a powerful person is that a powerful person has a choice. He has a choice to suffer their own suffering. In fact, I tell my students that the suffering which causes the critical theory or the Rida is causing you, this is the suffering which you should choose. This is the power in suffering. So Anna and Molly also, they are going to a shrink whom they call Mother Sugar.
Yeah.
This tells us that they are not happy, but happiness is not the goal. It's not the happiness which is a goal. In fact, the Victorian heroines, or before that even, the characters we have in Jane Austen, for example, those were the happy women. But this whole women's movement actually, uh, uh, what it has achieved is that we have moved from that kind of happiness to the happiness which Anna and Molly receives at the end. So, I mean, this is my perspective of it. Thank you.
Okay, Shubhajit, so do you want to respond, or are there other people who have questions for either Shubhajit or Ujjwal?
I thought that was an interesting point that Ujjwal made about two different kinds of happiness. Interesting, because I'm not sure if too many people have thought about two different kinds of happiness.
Oh no, Subhajit, we all have. Perhaps on the other side of the gender border, but
That's
never mind that.
Yes,
Sorry about that. But I think Ujjwal has placed it so very well.
Yes.
I think it kind of
I particularly meant that
formulating it was very different from how we
yes,
look
I
at
mean
it.
that divide that she talked about, the early narratives of 19th century novels, and then the more complex writings later, once the women's movement took off.
Josna, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, I had two things. First, Ujjwal, I just want to say I was fascinated throughout, and I think your students are very lucky. The way you lay it all out is beautifully done, and yeah, I you know, it was very interesting because I always thought about the Golden Notebook in terms of, you know, the compartmentalization being a sort of pathological thing, but you know, needing to do it to survive in this crazy world. But then also, in order to really survive and grow and break through, you have to be willing to break down to come out the other side. So when you talked about the golden mean, at first I thought, is that what they had? But actually, you can't have the golden mean until you've come to a crisis and gone through the breakdown. So yeah, I loved it. Shubhajit, so many things you were talking about that, you know, there's 17 questions and comments that I have. One thing is just a quick comment. You might be interested, and I have the link, if that Edward Said, just before he died, he wrote an introduction to the 25th anniversary edition of Orientalism, in which he called for, and he was also president of the MLA that year, of the Modern Language Association, and this was based on his, I can't remember now if it was that, no, but he gave a talk where he called for a new humanism that didn't just be irrelevant and talk about universalism in a vacuum, but really engaged with the differences in the world and the complexities and the inequalities, but nevertheless maintained that-centered, human-focused compassion. And I think you'd find it very useful because it's a real update. So you can look it up, and I actually could put the link in the chat.
That would be very nice for all of us.
Yeah, I'll do that before we end. But the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking was that, yes, indeed, the author's position in writing The Grass is Singing is complex because of multiple intersectionalities, right? There is, yes, she's white, but she's a anti-racist white, the author we're talking about. Now the character is white, but she's lower class white, and she is We have the dynamic, unequal power dynamic between her and her black servant. But what about the unequal power dynamic between her and her white husband? So if we take into account all of these different intersectionalities, we see that the position of the main character, Turner, is, we can understand it better. We can understand the pressures that are leading to her breakdown, to her mental illness. And then we can do the same with Doris Lessing when thinking about her complex positionality. And I was thinking right away comparatively of mistress-servant relationships, unequal mistress-servant relationships, not only in other post-colonial novels or other African novels, but also in Indian short stories and works written by women about their relationship with their servants, whether they be male or female. And there you have this complicated ambivalence, and they're middle-class women trying to represent someone of a, unprivileged, class, oppressed class, speaking for them in a way that perhaps they shouldn't be, or they can't really reach, they can't really represent them. And so it raises all those same questions in the Indian setting, which your students would be able to engage with. And then maybe it would make something like that, maybe a short story of Doris Lessing's that looks at white settler discourse and, her analysis of it. She has one like that. I'm blanking on the Home for Highland Cattle, I think is one.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I mean, those are the thoughts that came to mind. And the only other thing I would say is that for post-colonial, I mean, I am an apologist for post-colonial, the importance of it in this era, because we're in an imperial era where countries are invading other countries and all kinds of language about us and them is being thrown about as much as any other time, so I think it's extremely valid. And I think that post-colonial writing doesn't just have a black and white, a rich and poor, colonizer, colonized. It looks at the ambivalence of that position, about the, interrelationship and the mutual need of the colonizer for the colonized, and the other way around, and the way in which the two partake of each other and are codependent in pathological ways, but also perhaps in potentially fruitful ways. So anyway, I just, what you talked about raised so many problems. The difficulty of teaching that book, I kudos to you for attempting it. And I'll stop there.
I also wanted to, just say one more thing, which is what Jyotsna set me up to. And Jyotsna, that's a very interesting and very fascinating argument. But, when Lessing is called a colonial in exile, she actually flees from southern Rhodesia because she finds it insular, she finds it stifling, and she's horrified that a small white minority is really ruling and oppressing a very, very large non-white population. So when she goes back to England, to her credit, and England
There's no going back. She doesn't go back, right? She's never been there.
Sorry, she was there for that very short period when they traveled from Persia and stay, and she was very little at that point. So, I'm just saying goes back. I'm sorry, I'm just making her do a lot of journeys when she was not at all. All right, so when she goes to England, she is among the writers who's talking about race. There's nobody else who's bringing race up. And there's something extraordinary that she does. And I think we also have to really look at the space of imperialism, of colonialism, because this is again a patriarchal worldview in which white women are subaltern. And if you look at the text, for instance, there's this whole space, there's this whole chapter, there's this whole book that is developed on how to advise the Brit who's staying in the colonies and what he should do and how he should settle down. There's this whole section in the book which used to give them advice on settling down with local women. And at some point, when there's this whole talk about miscegenation, this whole chapter was thrown out of the window. So it's very interesting that Lessing as a white woman is negotiating this, and her character as a white woman is also placed in spaces in which she is the subaltern as well, as poor white, as wife to a white man, as an unmarried single woman who now has to succumb to the peer pressure of getting married. To as somebody in exile, she takes a plane and goes. She's trying to get off the plane and she's sent back home. She is prohibited from it. It's a terrifying space. And she keeps talking about the sounds and sights of Africa because she feels that with modernity and modernism, all those are fading because, change is like sort of quadrupling and taking away old sounds and associations. But there's no point in the narrative when she wanted to, stay on. And, you compare her to someone like Nadine Gordimer, who continues to live in Africa despite so many other things. Or you look at someone like Muriel Spark, who stays in Africa for a short time, flees back to Scotland and to her roots, and never looks at Africa again. So, there are all these other engagements also with race and color and colonialism, as it were. Okay. More questions. More questions to the other speaker, to the speakers. Chandra.
In response to that, I would like to say that yes, it is true that Lessing had a certain fascination for Africa and believed that Africa had the potential to offer much to writers. It was a resource that had to be exploited by writers. And in her collection of stories called African Stories, she says, I'm reading a portion that I extracted from that book. She says, I believe that the chief gift from Africa to writers, white and black, is the continent itself, its presence, which for some people is like an old fever, latent always in their blood, like an old wound throbbing in the bones. So that's how, that's how Lessing conceived Africa as something, as an entity that she was strongly connected to as a writer.
Yeah, and I remember being moved to tears when all the money that came, Nobel Prize money, she sent immediately to Zimbabwe for children's schools. And I just thought that there was such an extraordinarily Lessing thing to do. And that is Lessingness. Thank you.
At the same time, I think what you said, Subhati, which is really important, is that she is in this ambivalent position. She does partake, whether she wants to or not, of the colonial positioning. And a lot of white settlers romanticize the land. Relative position of power, so that they might say they were born there. The use of native, because also there's a lot of white settlers in places like Rhodesia and Kenya who were born there, and some of the Afrikaners who've been there for generations. So it really complicates. They feel themselves to be African, and yet they know they're also exploiters of the Africans. And so, those positions can be very contradictory. And the power dynamic is still very much there. She can't help but partake of that romanticizing of the land
Josna, I don't know whether she romanticizes the land, but even that is very interesting because the landscape is so new.
Yeah,
it doesn't exist. Otherwise, you're talking about the heat of India. You're talking about the rivers of Asia. You're talking about the blackness and the savagery of Africa. So I found it very welcome. I said, oh my God, no blue skies, no daffodils, and no snow-covered peaks. This is amazing.
That's great.
So it's not a romanticism so much, but she's drawing our attention to an alternate, geographical landscape. And it's not, we had this movie which was called, what was it called? Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara.
Right.
I've seen this film, Josna, but you could watch it. This is a movie where Europe is being romanticized. Something as idiotic and wasteful as the Tomatino Festival is being romanticized. That's not what Lessing is doing at all. Okay, so
I think that remark by
we all can continue throughout the night. The way.
okay, yes.
Please carry on. We have time.
That remark by Lessing, which I referred to, where she says that Africa belongs to those who feel at home in it. That I think is very controversial, and that can be the launching pad for a discussion along the lines that Josna suggests.
okay.
Does the country really belong to those or to whoever might feel at home in it? That's the problem. That's the problem.
But South Africa now has to deal with it. It's supposed to be a non-racial society, and yet so all those different groups who are there, who some of whom want to kill each other and have grounds for that, still have to live with each other and try to make a pluralistic democracy work. And even though those white settlers have committed atrocities during the time of apartheid, they're still there, and they're still walking the streets free, and they are citizens of South Africa too. That's how the Constitution is written. So we have to wrestle with these things, if we want to make our democracies work.
And if we want to move forward also, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay, Chandrava, you wanted to speak? Ask a question.
Yeah, I mean, it has really been a fascinating evening, even for a person who is a non-Lessing scholar. It was so interesting, and we really had a very fruitful discussion also. But we have to close today, and so just a few words from the part of the organizing body. That is, we don't have any webinar tomorrow. It is for our Bangladeshi friends who have their Independence Day tomorrow. But we will again resume this on Sunday, same time from 5 p.m. A little, maybe 5 minutes prior to 5 that we all log in. And it will be the same link, the same link that we used today to join. Okay. So good night and good day to everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
I just had one word to say. If Buthina Mahul, who was here today, and if she continues to be there on Sunday, maybe request her presence in the round table.
That's a nice idea.
Nice, because
Very
Buthina
nice.
is here, and
To be there, Buthina.
I'm here. Thank you so much. I was listening, and it was very, very inspiring. Thank you so much. I'll be there on Saturday. Yes.
no,
On
it's going to be
Sunday.
it's going to
Sunday,
be Sunday
sorry, yes.
for.
And would you like to be part of the round table at the end?
What time? Yes, sure.
It's
I'll be
the
there.
last session, if you look on the program, because Robin Weisel was going to give the final address, but she has a family. Her mother is very ill, and so we are doing a roundtable instead, where several of us will just make a few brief remarks and then open it up for discussion, looking back at the whole program.
I'll be presenting at the conference at 11 a.m. my time, but I think that I can join right after, so I'll be there.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the talks. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone, and happy Independence Day to the Bangladeshi friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Happy Independence Day.
Thank you. But tonight,
51 years? Is it 51 years?
50, yes, it's 51st.
51st.
But the fact is that this is the night when the worst genocide
That's
took
right.
place.
That's right.
Perfect night. Yes.
Very
So
fine.
it's a black night in our history. Anyway, so thank you for wishing us. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Have a
See you.
memorable day.
Thanks to the presenters.
Welcome.
Yes.
Bye, bye, everybody.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.